What's up, guys? Doug Polk here. Welcome back for another episode of the Doug Polk podcast. It's been a little bit, couple weeks off here at the podcast. I'm very sorry. I got pretty sick for a week or two there, but I am back, and we are ready today to go through who are the greatest poker players all time. We're going to narrow it down just to 20 people. You guys voted. We've got the list here now. We're going to talk about biggest snubs, and then we're going to rank who we think is the best, culminating in you guys voting once again for one final vote on who is the greatest poker player of all time. We are joined today by Mike Brady, once again, known from Upswing Poker. Mike will be joining us to discuss all of these players. And then we're also joined by Kane, another well-known poker professional, ex-poker professional. It's been a few years now. We'll be joining us to talk about that as well. So all of that coming up for you. Now I'm going to introduce today's guests, Mike and Kane. Welcome to the panel, everyone.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Awesome. Great to have you. Kane, I got to give you some credit. Of all of the people I know, when I started making this list, you were by far and away the most interested and the most consistently giving me feedback on the list. Who should be on, who shouldn't be on. You were outraged at one point. There was legitimate outrage at some of the initial names. I said, okay, we got to get this guy back on. Simply have to for this list.
I've been a thorn in your side for a couple weeks now, and I'm glad I can continue to be one today.
I just want to say sorry I put Tilly on the list. Are you sleeping at night? That
Well, finally, we're down to the final 20. I don't see her there, so now I'm able to finally get some rest, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, it should be a good one today. Here's the way today's podcast is going to go down. We're going to read to you guys the top 20 that you voted in. This is in no particular order, so we RNG'd it to not bias the results. Then after we read that, we're going to go through most notable snubs, and then we're going to take it from there. Mike, by the way, your keyboard is picking up pretty loud on this. I'm not sure what's going on with that, but there you have it. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's go in. I'm just going to read off the top 20. You guys all voted on this, and these are your top 20. The list is as follows. Tom Dwan, Chip Reese, Eric Seidel, Phil Hellmuth, Johnny Chan, Daniel Negreanu, Isaac Haxton, Fedor Holz, Doug Polk, Patrick Antonius, Victor Blom, Doyle Brunson, Dan Cates, Justin Bonomo, Phil Ivey, LLinusLLove, otherwise known as LLinusLLove, Phil Galfond, Jason Koon, Stu Ungar, and Steven Chidwick. So I'm going to kick it off with this. What do you guys think about the top 20 that we've got here, this list?
Well, I don't know if you said, forgive me if you did, but that was in no particular order. That was a randomized order.
Randomized order, correct.
I mean, kind of as you'd expect, a lot of those big names making the top 20. In my opinion, some of them over more deserving, less known names. I kind of noticed something with the results, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but it seemed clear to me that a lot of people who did the voting went down the list and gave the lowest possible score, a 1 out of 5, to everyone they sort of didn't know or everyone they didn't like. And that sort of brought the average results down a little bit. And I think people in general didn't necessarily look into a specific player. They kind of looked for who they recognized and then often gave it a higher score. And the results definitely show that. I mean, there are certainly a lot of deserving people in the top 20, but some really brutal snubs as well, which we're going to go over.
Absolutely going to go over. Let's jump into that now. I want to give a quick shout out to the person that finished in last place here, because it's pretty notable. The worst player on this list, as voted from the community, Dan Bilzerian. And it's pretty impressive because you can only vote 1 through 5. Dan managed to get a 1.36. So that means 2 out of every 3 people voted Bilzerian as a 1 on a 1 to 5 scale, despite the fact that he has probably made more in poker than, I'm going to say, 90% of this list, 95% of this list. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bilzerian would say he's made more in poker than everybody on this list, right? So it really comes down to how you're defining what is the best poker player of all time. Is it the person who made the most money, or is it the person who has the best skills? And what game are we talking about? Are we talking about all forms of poker? Are we talking about one form of poker? Also, is part of the skill of poker being able to organize and get invited to good private games, right? A big problem, though, for Bolzarian was that his results really are not able to be confirmed by any third party, right? We basically need to take his word on how much he's won or hasn't won in these games, and therefore it's very difficult to make any assessment on whether or not Dan Bolzarian is in fact one of the best poker players of all time.
I could give you on good source from good sources that he has in fact won tens of millions of dollars from poker.
Could you give me from Bill? Did you talk to Bill?
I've talked to a bunch of other people as well about this.
You guys had a hilarious podcast, by the way.
Yes, actually, that's a great one. So I think I might have talked about this on a previous podcast. I forget now. But basically, when I first heard that Bolzarian was saying he made all of his money from poker, I thought, I don't think that's true. For some reason, I think he's almost never said this before. And then, he was saying that he did make all his money from poker. And then one of the fans of this podcast tweeted at me a link, and they said, Doug, this is why you think that. And I clicked the link. It's a link of me on a podcast with Bill. And I say, Dan Bolzarian, this is me. Dan Bolzarian says he made all of his money from poker. Then Bill Perkins says, no, he never said that. He didn't mean that. He never said that. I'll bet you he didn't say that. And I said, I think he said that. He said, no, I'll bet you whatever you want to bet right now. Dan does not think he made all of his money from poker. Or he did not start off with all of his money from poker, whatever the sentence is. And so I had to backpedal and say, I'm sorry. I guess he didn't say that. And then Bolzarian comes on my podcast and I have to eat it back the other way. I'm getting stomped on both sides of that conversation. It was pretty funny to look back and watch. But let's not get too tied up in Dan Bolzarian here because he finished in last place on this list. Let's get into some notable snubs. So going through here, starting at number 21. Number 21 was a pretty massive snub. Timofey Kuznetsov finished just one outside of the top 20. True Teller, I'm going to be a bit biased here, guys, because he's sort of my generation-ish. I know he's a little bit younger than me, but he kind of came up around the same period of time. And we're all going to be biased a little bit towards the people that we saw play really well, and particularly play against us, play really well. But this guy is an absolute savant. He has won in all sorts of poker. I can't think of someone that is better at super short stacks and super deep stacks. He's extremely good in both formats. Usually people are specialized more towards one side. Yes, he hasn't played many tournaments, but when he did, he played just the highest stakes one. He did extremely well there. Flies around the world playing in a lot of the highest stakes games that are available. Has played a lot of heads up, has played a lot of ring, has played a lot of online, has played a lot of live. I feel like this is a pretty epic snub to not have True Teller in your top 20.
It's really brutal. Really, really brutal.
Yeah, True Teller, I think, could, in fact, be the best poker player of all time, right? Some of these snubs are going to be people to just not have in the top 20. For me, True Teller could have been number 1. That's how big of a snub he is. And the reason why, when I think about, who the best poker player of all time is, one thing that goes into consideration, again, is versatility. True Teller is good at every single big bet form of poker, right? And then the other thing to think about is, just the person's poker mind in general. Right. You had mentioned in your last podcast, if a brand new form of poker was invented, who would you not want at your table? Right. In my opinion, True Teller just has to be on that list if he's not the answer for big bet forms of poker anyway.
Very good point. He figures games out extremely quickly. I've talked poker with him at a few different points. Extremely sharp. He picks up on important pieces of information very quickly, and he's played a lot of these mixed games. In fact, there was a pretty well known in the online community high stakes battle where True Teller and Phil Ivey were playing 400, 800 on PokerStars, and they played heads up for a good number of days or weeks or months. It was a very long battle, and rumor has it that this was also cross booked on the side hundreds of percent. So maybe it's 400, 800, but they were really playing 2K, 4K, or whatever the stakes were. And he did extremely well against Phil Ivey in these heads-up mixed games that Ivey has obviously had many years of experience in. And how much heads-up 8 game has True Teller even played? I mean, probably not very much. I bet you when he started, he was learning how to play some of those games, right? So he's someone that has not been afraid to jump into new games and has really been extraordinarily good, if not one of the world elite in all of the games that he's chosen to partake in.
For quite some time, and even today, he's battling the highest stakes games, both live at Triton and currently online at Coin Poker. He's sitting in the lobby all the time playing nosebleed stakes games on there. So, I mean, this guy's just at the top, sitting the lobby at the top of the highest stakes games in the world. So he would get my vote to be one of the best players of all time. A huge snub.
Yeah.
He's had a lot of staying power too. I mean, he's been around for what, 12 years, maybe more. It's pretty amazing. Speaking of players who are extremely well-rounded and you wouldn't want at your table if you were playing a new game, Matt Ashton was a pretty brutal snub. I was talking to Chris Kruk about this, who's a great player himself, and he was talking about, he would argue that being kind of like what Kane said a moment ago, being versatile, being good at a lot of different games is potentially something that makes you the best poker player. And Matt Ashton is considered by Chris Kruk, for example, and a lot of other people to be the best player in terms of well-rounded at mixed games. He's just great at all the different mixed games, has battled at very high stakes, cash, doesn't have quite as many reps in like the tournament mixed game streets, which I think kind of hurts how well he's known and such. But the particular brutalness about his snub is he came in at 99, 1.732 average, potentially and arguably by many the best mixed game player in the world. Number 99, just absolutely brutal. Definitely another example of someone just not having that name recognition.
I think that the list here speaks volumes as to what the common poker player thinks about mixed game players and mixed games, which is they don't fucking care about them. And I know that there's a community of people in Las Vegas and in the high stakes world that love all these interesting, unique games that you have to think about outside the box and you can't look at solutions for, and you get a bajillion cards. But guess what? The average person does not give a shit about that. And they don't give a shit about who's good at them. And they don't give a shit about who's playing them. And they certainly don't want to watch them. And they don't even want to hear them. And they don't care who the players are that are the best at them. Do you think that that's, I mean, it's certainly true when we just look at this list. Do you think that maybe the public should have more of an appreciation for these games, Kane? Or do you think that realistically, it's going to come down to what does the average person want? And it's fair to just throw these guys, I don't know, sweep them under the rug.
No, I do think the public should have more of an appreciation. I mean, I think you and I had, a little bit of a discussion about what really makes the best poker player of all time. And I think your position is that it should be highly weighted towards no limit hold'em because that's the most competitive form of poker, right? But then getting back to what we were talking about in the beginning with Dan Bilzerian, where's the most money exchanging hands? Right, in live games, it's actually in the mixed games, right? These are the biggest live cash games that are running, right? So what's going to happen when that takes place? When the biggest public games are mixed games and not no limit hold'em, well, you're going to have the most talented poker players go learn how to play mix, right? And we see that with a couple people who are on this list. Ike Haxton is the most notable example, right? He's somebody who the public has agreed is in the top 20, probably because of his no limit hold'em talent, right? But Ike Haxton has become a very, very good mixed game player as well, just so that he can continue to compete in the highest stakes public games possible. Dan Cates is another good example of somebody who made this list. And Scott Seaver is somebody else who just barely didn't make the list. Who's another example of that. So we see all this talent coming from people who we can agree are very good no limit hold'em players moving over to mixed games, right? And that's just where the money is at the high stakes. So I think in order to not talk about somebody like even John Monet, right? Somebody who finished 90th here, right? Who's considered one of the best mixed game players in the world, if not the best mixed game player in the world. Another snub, in my opinion. I think is just a result of his lack of name recognition.
Well, we look at mixed games, a bunch of these names at the bottom. I mean, Cal Anderson, Abe Mosseri, Alexander Kostrason. I'm sure I'm butchering his name. All these guys are mixed game players, and just near the bottom. And look, like whenever you do a public vote on who is the best at something, you're going to have a big portion of it be who is popular. And I feel like we got a lot of that here, because when I look at the people that made the list and I look at some of the people that didn't, I can't help but feel like, even though I do think that the people that voted here, and we received thousands of votes for this, I do think the people that voted here gave it their all to try and put who they think is fair and look at it in an unbiased way. The reality is, this turned into a bit of a popularity contest. We knew that would happen to some extent, but is poker just a popularity contest, and does sort of the media narrative of people control this way more than anything else, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's a big part of it, right? I mean, you see the same thing in elections, right? You're much more likely to get elected if your last name is Clinton or Bush, or if you have some sort of name recognition. And the same thing is true here. It's people are going to vote for the people that they know and that they've heard the name, right? People don't necessarily have time to sit there before they're voting on your poll, Doug, and look at, well, how good really was Chip Reese back in the day, and how good is John Monet versus Abe Mosseri at mixed games? If it's not immediately discoverable to people, as Mike Brady alluded to, people might just go through and put a 1 for the people they don't really know, and I think that's what happened here. So in general, when you have these public type of polls, you're going to see a situation where name recognition is a huge part of it. Having said that, I actually think that the audience did a really good job in that. I do think that we have, of the 20 people I would have picked to be on this list, I do think more than half of them anyway are there, right? So that's a really good sign. And that shows us we definitely have something really good to work with here. But again, it is just a little bit weighted towards popularity. Once we get into the list, we can go over who those names were, who I don't think should be there, but are there as a result of their name popularity. But there definitely are a couple.
Mike,
I have a couple more quick snubs that are a little bit off the beaten path from the mixed game path that we've been on. What were you going to ask, Doug?
I was going to ask you actually, I wanted to ask both of you this, but who are your biggest snubs here that you have that didn't make the list?
Yeah, I mean, True Teller's number 1, but it's kind of like, doesn't feel too bad since he came in like just outside of the top 20 at 21. We already talked about a couple of those mixed game guys that are deep. There are 2 of the biggest online winners in the history of poker that got pretty tough results. Michael Thuritz, Chow Ren, brutally unfair to one of, if not the biggest online poker winners of all time. He came in at number 86, 1.95 average. Lars Luzak as well at number 64, 2.125 average. He's number 2 on the Pocket Fives all-time rankings for most online. I don't remember if Pocket Fives is profit or just cashes, but in any case, he's second on that list. And then he's also been in the mix at the highest stakes cash games as well. So at the highest level of poker online, he's been competing in both tournaments and high stakes cash games, and he's done well at both for a very long time, coming in at number 64. Not a great result.
Do you think that people care about online poker? It seems like they don't. This guy is one of the all-time big winners in online cash games. He's number 2 all-time in online tournaments, with way less tournaments played than the other guys in there. Do people even care what you did online?
I think they care if you find a way to get visibility out of it, right? Or if you find a way to then transition to live and show yourself as sort of having both tools in your pocket, being able to play both live and online. Because you look at some of the guys who did make the top 20. I mean, I would certainly consider Jungleman more of an online guy in general. Obviously, he made that transition. He made that jump to live and built his name recognition there. He also kind of was just a higher profile online player in general. And there are other online players that made our list too, but all of them, I mean, I'd argue you are an online player, Doug. But I think all of them were able to somehow find a way to increase their visibility, whether it was from breaking into live or just doing a lot of high profile stuff online and being like one of the top 5 most known online guys throughout their career.
I think that I agree with the overall sentiment there, but I also think that people don't give a shit what you did online. I think if you said to someone, this guy has been the best reg at 2856 max on PokerStars for the last 8 years. That sentence, when I hear that sentence, I think, oh, he's the best tournament player in the world. That's the way I interpret that sentence. You're basically saying, Doug, this is the best guy in the world. The way the average person interprets that sentence is he's just on his computer. Basically, the average player, or, oh, that's cool, but we're talking about real poker. We're talking chips and felt. The guy that can beat the best PokerStars 2850 reg over the last 8 years, hate to break it to everyone. You put them in any no limit hold'em cash game, that's the number 1 guy, period. He is the best. He's the sharpest. He has the best depth of knowledge. He's got the toughest opponents. He's proven himself time and time again. That is your best element hold'em player, period. But people don't seem to really value that. And I feel like a lot of these online guys just didn't get anywhere close to the top 20 because it simply doesn't matter. And I'll tell you what people really don't care about. People really don't care about online tournaments and mixed games, of course. But online tournaments, I mean, what online tournament guy, I'm going to be honest with you guys, I couldn't name any when I started this list. So the online tournament community, Pads said, you know, this is a shame that you have none of the best players from online tournaments. And so I put some on and I felt a little bit bad about it. I realized, oh my God, I don't know any of these people. He put a list together of these are their names of the people that are the best online tournament players. I looked at the list. I didn't know any, never heard of any of them. Some of the screen names a little bit I'd heard of, like Lena 900 and stuff like that. A couple other ones as well, European. But in terms of just knowing these people, I think that the average person just does not care about online poker when it comes to honoring historically great poker players.
Well, and that is a good segue into our next snub, who we haven't discussed so far, which is Sauce. And Doug, I know you have a lot of history with Sauce. You're talking about somebody sitting the lobby for a number of years at the highest possible stakes, right? Not just in No Limit Hold'em, but also in Pot Limit Omaha, right? Tell me, Doug, whether you would have put Sauce in your top 20, and tell me why. Tell me why you think he's a snub.
Of course, I would have put Sauce in my top 20. He was my snubs were boring because the two biggest snubs in my eyes were the guys that got 21st and 22nd. So they're not the Matt Ashton level of snub where you're one of the best ever and you're put at the bottom of the list. But the reason I think that Sauce is such a snub in this context is the guy played top-notch people in all the games that he ever played, and he won in almost all of them. And when I look at this list, I look at the top 20. Who has a greater mind for poker than Sauce? And I look at the people above him. I might say none of them. I might say honestly, none of them have the ability to create strategies in a beautiful way, the way that Sauce can make them. And he did that before a lot of these people. I mean, the only other people that I would put sort of in that vicinity, I think that Daniel Cates has a really natural knack for figuring out great strategies. I think Isaac Haxton's another very smart player who can put together some great strategies quickly. True Teller, who also didn't make top 20. But in terms of overall poker mind and approach with balance, it just simply has to be Sauce for me. And so it's hard for me to not put one of the greatest poker minds of all time, if not the greatest, in my top 20, just because he didn't play live poker. And that's really what this is. This is basically, if you played only online poker, that's really cool. We don't give a fuck. Basically, that's what this list is.
There is one exception, which we will get into, of course. Any other notable snubs for you, Kane?
Well, to be honest with you, Doug, after seeing this list, based on everything you just said, I was hoping you'd expand it to 25 because we covered a couple of the snubs. They just barely didn't make the list. Another one who didn't, in my opinion, if we're talking about well-roundedness and being good at every game, is Scott Seaver. I mean, Scott Seaver was playing the highest stakes online back in the day, right? This really ties into both. He was playing the highest stakes online back in the day, which people allegedly don't care about, right? But then he also transitioned to mixed games. He's one of the best mixed games players in the world, always playing Bobby's Room, right? And I think he just came in, in 25. So he was close to making that list.
I would argue I don't think Scott Seaver is a snub. I think that even though he is a well-rounded player, he strikes me as one of those guys that always kind of got by. You know what Scott Seaver's like? Scott Seaver's like that kid in school. He's smart. He gets pretty good grades, but he just never applies himself. I can coast through this one. I can just take care of it tomorrow. I'll just cheat off the guy next to me. You know what? I have good test taking skills. I'll be friends with the teacher. He never opens the book up, cracks it open to chapter 3, and then spends 3 hours taking notes. He doesn't, because he's never had to. That's Scott Seaver. That's why he shouldn't be in the top 20.
Doug coming in hot.
Strong take. And it's talking about online tournament guys. My final one, which would be a great way to actually include an online tournament guy, who he actually does a whole lot more than that, was Paul Volpe. I was strong on including Paul Volpe in the original list. And Paul Volpe is somebody who was at the very top for online tournaments, right? Then he started to play live, wins all sorts of bracelets in all different types of events, right? He's the biggest winner in East Coast cash games. And in MTTs in the East Coast, he's the guy, right? If there's tournaments at Borgata, right, It's going to be Paul Volpe, Joe McKeon, Darren Elias at the final table, right? So in my book, Paul Volpe is one of the best at all time just because of his well-roundedness. I mean, he's doing it in cash games, he's doing it in tournaments, right? He also played big bet cash games, Pot Limit Omaha, the biggest stakes in the East Coast. So, and he's been doing it for years, right? Ever since he was old enough to play online poker. He was one of the best online tournament players.
I think Paul is a very good player, but the problem Paul is going to run into is he's kind of been the proverbial big fish in a small pond in basically all of the games that he plays. And he's had some good World Series of Poker results as well. So that's not entirely true. But when I look at Paul, he's usually the best player in a medium-ish lineup. He's never the best player or one of the best players in the world-class lineups. And that's obviously fine to kind of carve out your own space and be the best player in that. But yeah, he's in the East Coast games. He's playing on Poker Night in America. He's playing in some of the mixed games he's playing in smaller pools that have weaker competition.
Fair.
Yeah, pretty reasonable. You guys want to get into this top 20 in a second, but before we do, I want to give a quick shout out to the two biggest write-ins. We did have a write-in option for the vote, just in case there was anyone who was not included in that top 100 that were available to vote on. Everyone who voted had 3 fields that they could enter in different write-in players. No one had so many that they really needed to be included in the top 20. But I think it's right to give a shout out to the 2 people who did get a lot. Number 1 is an online guy, Katya18. I actually don't know his real name, but he's been a high stakes cash player for a long time. Not sure if they got in the tournament scene much. I'd imagine a little at least, but they were definitely more of a cash player. And the other one is someone who's definitely done both, Adrian Mateos. I believe he won the World Series of Poker Europe. He ran deep in the main. He's a crusher in the super high roller scene around the world. I believe he's from Spain, if I remember correctly. Really, really great player. So 2 very reasonable write-ins that definitely deserve a shout out.
Absolutely. And I played with Adrian Mateos a little bit. I thought he was a very tough player to play against. Tough borderlining and going into spewy at times. But I do think there is something to be said for when you're playing in the higher stakes scene that people just kind of want to stay out of your way a little bit. And he was one of those guys, if you were looking for spots to kind of go after someone or make a stand or make a move that was close, really hard to bluff him. Very difficult player to win more than your fair share of pots. And I think that there is something to be said for that, where it's not always good to be tough when it comes to the expense of paying people off, aka me at the lodge this year. But it certainly goes a long way when you're playing in a small pool of players in high rollers where people know that you're going to be tough. And he absolutely was one of those people.
That makes sense.
And Katya, by the way, Katya, obviously one of the best players on PokerStars 2550 for more years than almost anyone. So, definitely not a top 20 player.
Of course not. Of course not.
I mean, look, you only beat all the best people for years. You're going to have to do more for me.
Yeah, no doubt. All the best people in the most popular game, but so it goes. All right, you want to hop into this top 20? Start talking about these guys?
Let's do it.
All right, so again, note everyone, we're going to go through these top 20. We're going to have their pictures on screen while we're talking about them with some stats and stuff like that. This is not in any particular order, so the first person we show is not necessarily the person who got the best vote. That's all you got to keep in mind. So with that, let's move into our first person, Tom Dwan. So guys, the case for and against Tom Dwan, what do we think?
Look, I understand that Tom Dwan embodies a generation of poker players. I understand that he was the golden boy. I understand that a lot of us, myself included, looked up to Tom Dwan for many years. But I want to burst the bubble for a lot of people. There are so many reasons why Tom Dwan should not be in the top 20 here. And the reason that he is in the top 20 is because he is an extremely popular player that a lot of people view as sort of a representation of them from that era. Tom Dwan at the high stakes scene is viewed as a very weak player. He's too loose. He doesn't bluff enough. It's not that he's not capable of bluffing. He's definitely capable of bluffing, but there's a difference between being capable and bluffing at a high enough frequency and being consistent with it. In the heads up scene online, which is, in my opinion, very biased, of course, one of the pinnacles of competitive play, all of the high stakes regs wanted to play Tom Dwan. That's why he got people who accepted the Dur challenge, never finished the Dur challenge with Jungle. And realistically, even though he played some pretty cool hands in high stakes poker, what has he really done? I mean, he had the bracelet bets over the summer for the World Series. He didn't win any. You know why? He's too loose in speed to play full ring. What is Tom Dwan actually good at? What is Tom Dwan really won at? And as far as I'm concerned, the guy's up, several $1 million online. Yeah, take away Guy Liberté, he's down. He's down money if Guy Liberté doesn't exist online. How is this guy anywhere remotely close to top 20 of any poker list whatsoever? This is a sham that you people put this guy in here. It's insulting to poker. It's insulting to this podcast, and you should be downright ashamed of yourselves.
Kane, agree, disagree?
So I agree with a lot of that, and specifically talking about Dur's online results. I think on poker table ratings, which was big back in the day, right? I believe Dur was running at about 2.3 big blinds per 100, something like that. It wasn't like he was crushing the games he was in, right? And these, again, are games with Guy Liberté. These are games that are pretty soft. Counterpoint, however, Dur would play 6 tables at a time against 2 different opponents. Pot limit Omaha, no limit Hold'em, right? I mean, he'd be playing a lot of different games all at once, concentrating on all of them, right? So that's obviously very, very hard to do. But I generally agree with Doug. I don't think that Tom Dwan belongs anywhere near this list. I think this is an example of a guy with name recognition that came as a result of his TV exposure. He was the first online guy to really break into the TV scene, and people just like the fact that I think the reason he's on this list is because he plays badly, right? Because he calls a 4-bet with a 6-3 offsuit, which sometimes has worked out for him, right? But in general, as Doug was alluding to, in general, it doesn't. And he's seen as not necessarily a spot, but one of the players who you don't mind having in the game if you're competing at the top, at the highest level today. And finally, about the Dur challenge. Right, he beat Patrick Antonius in the Dur Challenge, which is a big accomplishment. Patrick's also on this list. He's one of the best players of all time. But after that, he was losing to Jungle. He didn't even finish the challenge. And what I can tell you is that as the challenge was taking place, there were other players who were happy to play Dur heads up. They just didn't want to put up the money for the challenge or commit to that amount of time. And I was buying pieces of some of these players. One of them was Touche, right, who was just happy to have Dur's action whenever he could, right? So this idea that Dur was the best heads-up player in the world for any period of time, I think in any game, I think is wrong. Also, Phil Galfond was blocked from the Dur challenge, right? So that's almost a concession that Phil Galfond might in fact have been better than Dur at that time anyway. But we know that Jungleman was beating him heads up, and other regs were beating him heads up during that time.
I think it's fair to say he is a lifetime losing heads-up player. If we look at his online, unless there's private stuff in Macau that's gone down, but certainly online, he has won more money in the 6-max games than his overall winnings. So he is down money playing online poker heads up.
Were
so
the games against Guy mostly 6-max?
They were 6-max, yeah. Real haven't, yeah. Look, like I get that he's a popular player. I get that people like him. I think you make a lot of good points there, Kane. The reality is for Tom Dwan. Let me actually ask you this, Kane. You're fairly well networked in the poker world. Do you think there is a single high level player, high stakes player, that if you ask them, is Tom Dwan a great poker player? Is there a single one that would say yes? A single one?
Outside of wanting to be politically correct, right? I mean, most of them would say yes because his reputation precedes him. But I think the more important question is how many people, if they were coming up with a list of people they didn't want at their table, right? Would Tom Dwan be on that list of the top 10 or 20 players they don't want at the table? I don't think he would be on anybody's list. I think, in fact, he's more likely to be on a list of people that they do want at the table than people they don't want at the table, and that says something.
But guys, counterpoint, and I think this is what was in our voters' heads. He had that sweet Queen 10 bluff back in 2009 or whatever. So I think that's top 20 worthy.
Tom Dwan, just to play the devil's advocate here for a moment. Tom Dwan has had some incredible TV hands. Incredible TV hands against Phil Ivey. He ran, there was a huge bluff he ran against Phil Ivey, where Phil, I think, had top pair. And I think the nut flush draw he bricked, and Tom fired the river.
He actually just had. This actually might detract from that hand from Dur. Dur had some amazing. I'm losing the word here, but it was a great bluff from Dur. 9 high, ran it on 3 streets on.
Oh yeah,
Kane,
that's right.
Queen
He
10, something like that. But Ivey just had ace high missed flush draw, and he thought about calling the river. That almost to me detracts from a little bit. He was like thinking about calling with one of the worst calling hands, so it kind of takes away from that bluff a little bit to me.
Well, missed flush draws are actually a lot of times good calling hands because club combos aren't supposed to barrel. We don't want to get too into.
But here's the other thing about that, Doug. I don't think we knew that yet.
True. Very true.
This was long enough ago that we did not know that that was a thing. So I don't really. It's kind of a weird thing to reconcile. Should we apply our current knowledge to past hands like that?
Doug, did you play against Tom? Do you have any personal experience playing against Tom?
He sat me one time on full tilt, and I wasn't at my computer. And to this day, I feel upset that I wasn't there for that action. That would have been a great match. I played live poker once or twice with him. Played with him in Australia, and then I played with him once at the Aria. But very little.
I can speak personally. I played Rail Heaven with him a number of times, and I was not happy for him to be at the table. Right, but there were other players who didn't make this list who I would have been more unhappy for them to not be at the table, and they're not even, top caliber players. These were just people who were solid 6 max players who I'm like, okay, I'd rather have Dur at the table than this person, right? And there is one person on the list who was in those games who I'd much prefer Dur being at the table than that person. That was OMG Clay Aiken.
Totally fair. I actually wanted to briefly say this before we started this list, because we're getting into it without having talked about it, and I feel like we kind of have to discuss the elephant in the room, which is, what is the greatest poker player? What does that mean? And what does it mean to be a great poker player? Is it someone that's winning the most money? We talked about that a little bit briefly, but it's also someone that's playing at a high level. Is it someone you don't want your table, like you're saying? Is it someone that's capable of making moves? And another argument for Tom Dwan, as opposed to, I think, some people on this list and a lot of the other people on the list that didn't make it, what I also can give Tom Dwan is he is capable of a lot of aggressive, crazy moves that put people in terrible spots that a lot of these other people are not capable of. And so his ability, his capacity to make a huge play in a televised game, in a super high stakes game, in a really important spot, that's the guy has, he's got moxie when it comes to playing at the poker table. And that's something that we certainly have to give credit to him for.
I don't really value that very much. You know who else is capable of making huge moves is Scout.
Scout.
There are lots of people who can make
very online whales ever.
There are lots of people who could make moves. I don't think that makes you a great poker player to indiscriminately be putting lots of money in the pot with hands that you shouldn't. However, I do think that one thing that's important in my book is versatility. Your ability to not only win online, but also to win live. Your ability to not only win at cash games, but also to win at tournaments and sit and goes. Your ability to not only win a no limit hold'em, but to live in pot limit Omaha, short deck, and mixed games. And Tom Dwan actually has a decent amount of versatility. He was playing both 6-handed and heads up. He was playing no limit hold'em and pot limit Omaha online. When he transitioned to live, he learned short deck, right? So he plays a lot of different games. He's not a one-trick pony.
Kane, do you think a player that is sort of just a standard tag that doesn't bluff enough, do you feel like that should be a negative for them, that they're playing in a way that's just predictable and not very creative? Because in my mind, the best poker player is someone that is capable of making these moves. Yes, I love the Scout analogy. Of course, Scout was capable of all kinds of moves, but I feel like if you're going to look at me and say, okay, Doug, this guy is the best poker player in the world, but he doesn't really bluff that much, get out of line. He's just got a lot of discipline. That's not to say that's not a great poker player, but is that the greatest poker player? No, I think the greatest poker player needs to be able to make moves and put people in some pretty tough spots.
Well, I think you're setting up a straw man here because you said, you know, is he really the best poker player of all time if he doesn't bluff enough? The answer is no. He's the best poker player of all time if he bluffs the right amount and at the right times, right? So I don't want to give somebody extra credit for bluffing more than they should, just like I don't want to give somebody extra credit for bluffing less than they should.
I guess the response I would have for that is that so few people bluff enough, so few, and of that, the people that do bluff close to enough, they're more likely to do the small bluffs that are the little ones on the river, or the clear turn check raise with the draw, or those kinds of bluffs. And where I'm trying to give Tom Dwan credit here is that he's willing to take the unorthodox types of bluffs that you do need to occasionally do once in a while, that I don't think many people on this list would be capable of doing, and that is worth something.
It could be, but we're talking about we have assembled a list of the 20 best professional poker players of all time. So we should be able to find people who are bluffing when they should, and who are not bluffing when they shouldn't, and who are not calling a 4-bet with 7-3 offsuit when they shouldn't. And based on that, my vote for Tom Dwan is that, you know, I think he's certainly an iconic poker player. If we were talking about some of the most iconic poker players of all time, right? Somebody who really, you know, people could identify with, and, you know, I think Tom Dwan's definitely on that list. But for me, the best poker player of all time, Tom Dwan, in my opinion, shouldn't be in the top 20. He shouldn't be in the top 100.
Well, you really twisted my arm here, Kane. But I guess I'm going to be inclined to agree with you. It hurts to say that. All right, we can move on to the next person.
Yeah, on that note, let's go ahead and move on to our next top 20 vote getter, Chip Reese, legendary live player. I think he's been in like the World Series poker mix since what, like the 70s or something like that. Not super familiar, but something like that. 3 World Series poker bracelets. For a long time, was considered one of the top players around. This was kind of pre-moneymaker era even. What are your guys' initial thoughts on Chip?
Well, for me at least, it's a difficult one with Chip Reese because I was not around for his entire career, more or less. I started poker in 2007. That's when he won his basically biggest event. So it's a little bit difficult for me to look back on people like Chip Reese and I think give a fair assessment of their abilities. It's obviously before a lot of the software that's available where we learned things, what was good and what was bad. And additionally, I never got to play a hand of poker with him, and there are not many hands that are publicly available that he even played. So it's weird in a way because people that played public poker in the era before a lot of the bigger stuff online, the bigger stuff that was televised and some of these streams and things like that, they actually suffer from some of the same problems as these guys that played in Macau or played in private games or played in home games, where this is a little different in that we can see the results, but it's a little bit the same in that we can't sort of see what happened for a lot of it.
So in preparation for this podcast, I really did kind of a deep dive into some of the older school guys. And I'm happy to say that Chip, I think, is one example of somebody who the voters really got right, in that I do think Chip should be on this list. In fact, I think from my research among all the old school guys, I think there's the strongest argument for Chip Reese being the best poker player of all time compared to the others. And the reasons why are because he was just considered among his peers to be one of the best. Doyle Brunson said Chip Reese was the best player he ever played with. He's on Doyle Brunson's Mount Rushmore of poker. He actually wrote the 7-card stud part of Super System. And allegedly he was a winner from day one. He just sat down at a poker table and just his poker mind was amazing. He was known for, you know, it's funny because we were kind of just talking about this. Unlike Tom Dwan, he was known for his discipline at the table, right? Now, that doesn't mean that he wouldn't bluff. It doesn't mean that he wouldn't get out of line, but it meant that when you were playing against Chip, he was always playing his A game. And back in the day, you know, that wasn't true of everybody all the time. Chip also was ahead of his time in the way that he thought about poker. He coached a couple of the other old school poker players at the time. One of them was Ungar, who was a student of Chip Reese's. And one of the things that Chip was always trying to get through to Stu Ungar, and that Stu Ungar was known for having adopted and believing in later, is, you know, when you're at the table, not to take the monetary value out of the money. This is obviously second nature to poker pros these days, right? But back in the day, they're playing for huge amounts of money, you know, life-changing amounts of money with games that don't necessarily run all the time. It's not necessarily obvious. And finally, you know, allegedly from 1974 to 1975, Chip Reese in that 2-year period made $2 million, right? The present value of that, inflation adjusted, is probably what, $7 million that he made in 2 years playing poker from 74 to 75. And a lot of these stories are kind of made up in their lore. I heard that from several different people, that Chip Reese, if it wasn't 2 million, it was somewhere in the 2 million ballpark. So I think there are a lot of very, very strong reasons to consider Chip, if not one of the best players of all time, perhaps the best player of all time.
Wow, it's a very strong case. Glad you did your research there. That helps a lot for this.
It is really helpful. Someone in chat said something that I think is a really good point. When it comes to a lot of these older school guys, this chatter likened it to Wilt Chamberlain in basketball. It's like, we didn't really get the chance to see them play, so we're kind of just trusting that the old heads have it right when they say he was really great. You know, we don't have quite as much evidence, you know, that we can see with our own eyes.
Well, that's not really entirely true, right? Because there were a bunch of Wilt Chamberlain highlights. Whereas, how many Chip Reese highlights do we have?
Indeed, yeah. It's not a perfect analogy, but I think it's a good point.
Yeah, I see the point that they're driving at, which is the older people you don't have as good of evidence. But at least with the Wilt Chamberlain analogy, I can go back and I can watch clips of Wilt Chamberlain playing and see the domination, right? For Chip Reese, I can't pull up some of these events and watch him in action. So it is a little bit different.
And I think one question to examine here is, again, what makes you the best player of all time, right? Doug, in your opinion, if you were the best player from, let's say, 1974 to 1984, but it was not as competitive, right? There were fewer people trying to play poker for a living, right? Does that make a stronger argument for you being the best player of all time than somebody who was the best for 1 year in the 2000s? That's really a question that we need to consider when analyzing these old school guys. And if you don't consider that to be more impressive than the guy who was the best for 1 year in the 2000s, what would Chip Reese needed to have done to be the best player? Is it possible for any of these old school guys to, in your book or on this panel, be considered the best player of all time?
It's a good question. I would view it similar to how we view comparing no limit hold'em players today to mixed game players today, or to PLO players today, in that we have to take into consideration the pool of people that they were playing against and how competitive the atmosphere was. If you're the best player out of 20 players, that's a lot different than if you're the best player out of 200,000 players. So we have to think about that in the same context, where it's certainly possible that the best player from the years of 1975 to 1995, let's say it was a 20-year stretch, well, maybe they did way less. Maybe that accomplishment is much less impressive than someone that was the best online six max player from the years of 2015 to 2020. In my opinion, that second thing is much more impressive, in part because the sheer number of people trying poker in the 70s and 80s compared to where poker is today, it's a different ball game. And then second off, because of the level of play that you have to maintain to be able to be there. So it's not quite as much that the players today are better. I think maybe there's like a small part of that people play so much better today than back in the day. But you can't really hold that against the players from before, because they just didn't have the tools that were available now. But it really sort of boils down to how many people were trying to do what Chip Reese did, how many people were competing for that, and what is that like in today's environment. And I just feel like it's not anything close if you look at pre-Moneymaker Boom versus post-Moneymaker Boom in terms of how competitive the fields have become.
Yeah. To my mind, it kind of, if you could come up with a hypothetical poker player who was unquestionably the best all-around poker player from, say, 1975 to 1995, and they were super dominant throughout that entire period, I think there's a good chance that we would even all agree, like, that guy needs a really high mention on this list, if not number one. I don't think any of these old school guys were quite that dominant, though. There was no one who, you know, you look at, I don't know, their Hendon Mob or just general results, and you see, wow, they were just crushing everything for a very long period of time, back when it was, granted, the competition's easier, but it was also tougher to get good. You had to be a little bit better at just like using your brain to think logically about the game. I mean, poker's a really noisy game when it comes to getting better. I mean, sometimes you get feedback, you maybe make a bluff that works, but it turns out that was actually a bad bluff. You just got lucky and it got through, and now maybe you think that's a good bluff. That's like a really difficult thing about playing before we had all the tools we have now. So if someone was that dominant throughout such a large period like that, I think we would probably rank them really high. I just don't know if any player like that really exists. Maybe Chip Reese is one of the closest.
Seems like he would be, considering he had success at both cash games and tournaments. Seems like
the knock on Chip would be he was mostly a limit player, right? And most of the games were limit games back then, right? But no limit hold'em was starting to become a popular game. Certainly, as Doyle came around and came into fame, and he did play more live cash games, not as much tournaments. He does have success in tournaments, but not as much as some of the other old school guys on this list. But Chip Reese was just a final, note on the side. Everybody liked Chip. Everybody liked being around him. He was good at organizing games, right, and getting games going. And so, if we're talking about, one of the best all-around cash game players of all time, in my opinion, Chip definitely has to be on that list. And in my opinion, he deserves to be in the top 20 here, and a strong consideration to be one of the top.
What are your thoughts, Kane, on the longevity of a career and the consistency of a career versus the absolute peak of a career? And it reminds me a little bit of the Jordan versus LeBron argument. Not quite the same, because Jordan did have a very good number of years at his peak, but absolute peak LeBron versus absolute peak Jordan. I don't even think that most of the LeBron people would argue that LeBron wins there. Absolute peak Jordan in the 90s, it was just completely unstoppable. There was no counter. Absolute peak LeBron is kind of close, but it didn't have that dominance that Jordan did. I think an argument that would be made for LeBron is, okay, so sure, maybe absolute peak, you give the nod to Jordan, and if you compare their stats, they're quite similar. But look at the consistency of this guy's career. He's done this for, what's in his 17th season now, something like that, 17th, 18th, something like that. And he's still putting up 50-point games. He's still averaging. This is going to be one of his best seasons statistically he's ever had, and it's his 17th season. How much weight should we put on how great someone was at their absolute peak versus how sustained that greatness was?
Yeah. I mean, speaking about longevity, what about Tom Brady coming? Tom Brady is going to come out of retirement more times than Doug Polk by the end of this thing.
Hey, watch out. My favorite football player of all time is going to take issue with that.
But no, in my opinion, the longevity only matters to the extent that you are actually, that there's a legitimate arguments for you to be at the top first, right? So the longevity is like an added bonus once you're already at the top, right? So a good example of this would actually be a baseball example. Like if we're talking about the best baseball player of all time, and you said Cal Ripken because he's the Iron Man, I'm not okay with that argument, right? You actually need to have the stats and be good enough to actually justify being the best baseball player at all time. And then once you're talking among people who are in that elite category, right? Of course, Cal Ripken was great, but is he as good as, Barry Bonds as a hitter, Babe Ruth, right? Once you're in that elite category, then you can start talking about longevity, right? So I think it's definitely important, but less important than actually being at the very top. And it's almost a supplemental factor from being at the very top.
Well, if poker was baseball, we would need to see if we could get Mike Postle on the list, because cheating was certainly rampant. We don't have to go down the baseball story. It's actually not entirely fair to baseball.
But thanks to everyone. If you're just tuning in, this is the Sports Analogy Poker Podcast.
Let's move on.
What I was thinking is a better analogy than Wilt here is actually a chess analogy, right? If we're talking about how long somebody stayed the best in the world for the longest period of time, right, and whether or not old school players should be considered, right, in the chess world, Emanuel Lasker was just the undisputed champion of chess for 27 years, which is more than double anybody else, right? But that was like back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So people don't today consider him the best chess player of all time, even though he was at the top for almost 3 decades, right? Because it was a less competitive environment back then than when Bobby Fischer or Kasparov were competing in chess, right? So I think that's a pretty good analogy, and it's a good lens to look through this, right? But how much of it is because people didn't actually play with?
Even
What's
then, a lot of those games are recorded, so you can still go back and see what happened.
Not the games from the late 1800s, I don't think.
Yeah, there's chessgames.com. You can see all kinds of them. Like,
oh, yeah?
1800s. Yeah.
Wow.
Sure.
All right, well, anyway.
Maybe not
on
all
to the
of them,
next
but some of them for sure. Okay,
yeah.
Move on.
All right, Eric Seidel. Speaking of staying power, this is a guy that has certainly had it. I mean, he got second in the, was it 1989 main event to Phil Hellmuth, very famous, or rather 88 to Chan. Yeah, I got mixed up there. 88 main event to Chan. And now he just won, I believe, a year ago, the 10K High Roller online WSOP bracelet event, which, to quote some pro that I can't remember who it was, the bracelet that Eric Seidel won in that tournament on one bullet is among the toughest bracelets you could possibly win. So he's been battling at the highest level in 10Ks and higher in a lot of cases for, 35 years plus. So yeah, what do you guys think about Eric Seidel off the bat?
I've played a decent chunk with Eric, or with Seidel, what we're going to call him, back in the day, in my day anyway, 10 years ago or so, 6 years ago, when I was playing a bunch of high rollers. Eric was in basically all of them. What really stood out to me from the way that he played is that he would fight you tooth and nail. I think I said this before a little bit in the last podcast, but he'd fight you tooth and nail for even small pots. And that's just not really something that I feel like a lot of the poker players from his generation would do. And so it was tough to play Seidel. Seidel is a tough player, but not in a spewy, going to call you down with terrible hands. In a crafty, he understands he needs to be balanced, and he understands that the people that are playing the game, the new wave of players, that he's trying to learn what they're doing and how they're thinking and what strategies are better. And he's constantly thinking. He's very introspective, and he's constantly refining his strategy to make him tough to play against based on what he sees at the table, and also by competing consistently against some of the top players in the world. And that's one of the things that I really respect about Seidel. There's a couple other people on this list that I would say I respect this about them as well. He was constantly playing the top people in the world in tournaments and learning from that and trying to test himself versus that. And so I have a lot of respect for both the results that Seidel has had, but also the fact that he was so open to trying to improve his game by playing tough people. Certainly a all-time great tournament poker player.
Yeah, if for me, if this were a list of the best live tournament players of all time, right, Eric Seidel would be number one or perhaps number two on that list, right? But it's not. It's a list of the best poker players of all time. And if we're talking about the importance of versatility, Seidel just doesn't check the boxes for me. Because he doesn't play cash games, right? He doesn't play sit and goes. I don't think he's ever played had any notable results online. And no limit hold'em is his bread and butter. He doesn't branch out too often into the other forms, into the other mixes. So he knows what he's good at. It's been fantastic for his career. And if we were composing more specific lists, right, some of these names on this list who are more versatile probably wouldn't even be in the equation on some of those very specific. Who's the best tournament player of all time? Who's the best online cash player of all time? Seidel is definitely one of those guys. He would be my first or second choice for the best live tournament player of all time. He's just not versatile enough to be the best poker player of all time.
One very light correction there, Kane, though I 100% agree with what you're saying there about versatility, and this does not disprove it, but he did have that one notable result online in that 10K that I just alluded to a moment ago was an online event. So, a single data point, though, you don't want to put too much weight in that anyway. He certainly has been a no-limit hold'em tournament specialist in general.
I like that correction, Mike. Kane said that. He said, no, he won a tournament.
Hey, again, it's true. It's a tough bracelet to win. You probably can't be a slouch and win that one. Like, it's not one that just running good is going to be good enough.
I've talked to a number of people about, the best online tournament players over the 11 years that I'm old. 14 years I've been doing this, and been in the community, and the people who they wouldn't want to play online in online tournaments, and of course Eric Seidel's name has never come up over that period. So he's certainly not considered an online tournament player. I think he's a very, very, very talented one-trick pony who has had amazing longevity.
I'm pretty surprised that some of the other people on the all-time earnings list didn't make it. Not because I think they should. Like, I don't think that there's a world that Bryn Kenny should be in the top 20. But just when you're number one all-time earnings, it's surprising to me that you're not making the list of top 20 players, just because that number is so advertised and tournaments are the most visible form of poker. I'm surprised that the community seems to have not given as much credit towards that.
So that's to the credit of your audience.
Yeah, but what's weird about that is you might say, well, Doug, that's because it's your audience. But if my audience was my background, then these online cash game guys would be getting so much more credit. Quite clearly, there's a divergence between sort of my background and what you would think the audience would be versus what it is. And I think that, simply put, there's just not a lot of value put on tournament. I think when people think about who's the best player, they really tend to think about live cash games. That's sort of what's viewed as the pinnacle. Live
televised cash games specifically.
Probably live televised, no limit hold'em cash games.
But Eric's accounted that, right? I mean, Eric wasn't in too many of those.
Yeah, and I think that it's a bit surprising to me that. Well, it's not surprising to me that he got in when people like Bryn didn't, just because Eric has been doing it for so many years. It's the sustainability argument. Seidel has just been consistently great for so many years.
All right, well, ready to move on to the next one?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Right, fire away. Phil Hellmuth. I think no one is going to be surprised to see this picture hitting your screen right now, and for those listening to hear it hitting your ears. What do you guys think about Phil Hellmuth making this top 20?
I think that it's fair. I think that if we look at the history of Phil Hellmuth, how many years he's been winning in poker tournaments, the results he's had in those tournaments, the fact that he does also play a bunch of high-stakes cash games, even though he's probably not one of the better players in those lineups, the pure resume of how long he has played for combined with how long he has been winning for, he has the most of the most significant, the most tournaments won in the biggest tournament series in the world. There's just a lot of reasons why Phil Hellmuth deserves to be in the top 20, despite the fact that he has some kind of obvious drawbacks that I'm sure Kane would be happy to go into.
I'm actually on the Hellmuth train for him being on the top 20 as well. When I said that Seidel would if we just narrowed it down to live tournament, who's the best live tournament player of all time, I said he'd be first or second. Hellmuth was the person I was thinking of who could possibly be better than him, right? Most bracelets of all time. He, as Doug said, he does play some cash games, right? And I think winning the main event definitely bolsters your case for being the best player of all time, right? Even though it is just one tournament, right? It is the tournament that deems you the best player in the world, at least for that period of time. I think that the fact that Hellmuth has been able to continue to do this, right, in today's age and continue to make final table. I mean, look at his WSOP last year. I mean, he crushed, right? And he continues to crush. And every year, everybody says, well, Hellmuth, he doesn't play fundamentally solid enough to continue to do this. And he continues to do it. He's doing exploitative things in these large field tournaments that nobody else is. And it does make him one of the best of all time. And he also has won all sorts of heads up sit and goes against players who we all would have predicted would be beating him. And he's winning. Right. So at a certain period of time, you can criticize the way that he plays his hands. You could say he doesn't play the most fundamentally solid form of poker. Those are all valid arguments. But at the end of the day, it comes down to results. And Hellmuth has them.
When you mentioned the World Series of Poker main event, being a important accolade for a poker player on their quest for this to enter the top 20. Are we really going to put the pre-moneymaker era in that? Because yes, it's still impressive to beat out a field of great players and win what's considered to be the main event championship, the #1 tournament in terms of difficulty a year. But it's such a different ball game when I look at like the 1989 WSP main event versus the 2007, 2012, 2018. Are we going to view those in the same way?
I don't think they should be viewed in the same way. However, I still do think it's important. So when Hellmuth won the main event, it wasn't like when Johnny Moss won his first main event by vote, right? When Hellmuth won, there were actually 178 runners. So that's not a huge number of entrants like we have today, but it's also not a small number of entrants. It's more than double, for example, the years that Stu Ungar won. So, it was an accomplishment for sure. But I think just by having that title of being main event champ, it does sway the needle, maybe for me 3 or 4% in terms of what I would consider to be the best player of all time.
I would view that championship as less impressive than like the Seidel winning the 10K high roller, even though it's WSOP main event. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally disagree. I think I think that being deemed for any period of time the World Series of Poker champion, I do think, Doug, that you're underrating the competition when Phil Hellmuth won the main event and perhaps before that. So even though there weren't very many runners, right, these were some of the best players of all time, or some of the best players in the world at that time, excuse me. Whereas today, the main event gets many more just complete amateurs. Back in '89 and before, there weren't that many amateurs. So if you look at the very early years of the main event, it was literally like Chip Reese, Johnny Moss, Doyle Brunson, Puggy Pearson, Sailor. These were all guys who played poker professionally for a living. It literally was the toughest tournament to win. And by the time Hellmuth got in there, sure, there were a couple amateurs. But at the time, they were still the best poker players of all time. 80% of the field or so were the best poker players of that time.
Right, but the difference between being at the top and being in the middle of the pack was so much bigger then, because the average player was probably just so bad. I mean, even these well-known names that you're saying, they were probably not very strong opponents. It was such a smaller field of people.
Well, sure, but I mean, that's like saying that today, Babe Ruth wouldn't hold a candle on Mike Trout because the players were so bad in Babe Ruth's day. I don't think it's a fair comparison, right? In order to make that judgment, what you would need to say is, okay, if I, Doug Polk, were living in or competing in the World Series of Poker in 1985, would I have just won every year because everybody was so bad? No, you wouldn't have the same information that you have today, right?
I understand that, but in an era where there is not information available, the number of people that are going to be good players will be substantially smaller than an era where it is widely available. So when you play in a tournament now and you play in a 10K, let's just say, for example, the one that Seidel won, you're going to have a very large percentage of that play be very strong players. So it's just one of those things where I'm not trying to say that the players today are better. We obviously know that they are. I'm not trying to compare eras in that way. I'm just saying that that field is much stronger than the field would be in '89. Regardless, I'm not trying to take away from a main event championship. It is WSP main event championship. That is a big deal. That is something every poker player strives to win. I'm going to hit you with another drawback here on Phil that I don't hear talked about that much. I got to experience this firsthand. Most of my poker career, I was a nobody. The last 5 years, I built an online image, my name. I became well known from poker. 5-6 years now. And what I noticed was when I went from just being a really good online player that nobody knew to being who I am today, the way that people played against me in tournaments, particularly smaller buy-in big field tournaments, changed enormously. And all of a sudden, I was getting these opportunities that I simply would never have gotten before, because people either wanted to play a hand versus me, or they wanted to stay out of my way, or they purposely wanted to go into my way even when they really shouldn't. And since I've sort of built my name up online, I've just had these hands that day 2 of the main event a few years back, 4 or 5 years ago, someone just essentially gifted me their whole stack. They just randomly led in a spot that made completely no sense to lead. And then I called and they just overbet Ripped River. And I had some incredibly good draw on the turn. I hit a straight or a flush and they just jammed. And I called and they just had the hand that wasn't in there or whatever. And the guy said something along the lines of, I really didn't want to have a hand against you or something. You know what I'm saying? Something like that. That happens time and time again to me nowadays. And frankly, I should probably stop bluffing people and playing loose ranges because it's not paying off. I'll tell you that much. Applying that to Phil Hellmuth. Phil Hellmuth is one of the most famous poker players of all time. And when we look at his resume for where he's successful, a lot of times it's in huge field, smaller buy-in events. So is a lot of Phil Hellmuth's success today just the fact that people play awful against Phil Hellmuth because he's Phil Hellmuth? And is it really because he is one of the best poker players of all time?
I think you could argue he's maybe above, and it would be impossible to prove, but above average at sort of fair catching those punts, though. You know what I mean? Like, people are punting to him left and right, gifting stacks. I mean, perhaps he's well suited to it, especially with how many reps he's had at this point. It's tough to compare to other players, though, because other players just don't get that opportunity. So I definitely think that's a fair knock against Phil.
Let me. I disagree. Let me start by asking you this: if I sit down at the poker table and I show down a big bluff for metagame reasons, or I'm acting, like I'm drunk or loose or whatever, and it induces my opponents to play badly against me, right? Is that a credit to my credit that I'm doing something good as a poker player to get my opponents to play poorly against me?
If it's working for you, yeah, for sure.
Okay, and that's what Hellmuth has done. He doesn't need to do it in one session. He's done it across an entire career, right? He's based his career around garnering an image that has culminated in his opponents playing poorly against him.
Okay, but is this a list of who was well known during the poker boom, or is this a list of the best poker players of all time?
No,
and if you were fortunate enough to get all of the airtime during the biggest boom for poker and become one of those iconic names, and now that basically gives you an image where when you sit down, people want to punt to you. Is that the greatest poker of all time? I don't view that as being a great poker player. I view that as being a great marketer. I view it as being lucky to be part of that era, but that's not you playing phenomenal poker.
Phil Gordon doesn't have 16 WSOP bracelets, right? Tom Dwan doesn't have 16 WSOP bracelets, and he was somebody who we were talking about who's on that list specifically because of the TV exposure that he got. Phil Hellmuth,
I don't think Tom Dwan should be on that list either.
Right. Well, of course not. He doesn't have the 16 WSOP bracelets. But what I'm saying is that there were a number of people who were playing in high stakes TV games around the time of Phil Hellmuth. In fact, Hellmuth played in fewer of those games than did somebody like Negreanu or somebody like Ivey. Right. Nonetheless, he has the most WSOP gold bracelets of all time. He's 18th all-time money list. I think if he's doing things to get people to play badly against him, then good on him. That's what professional poker players, in fact, should be doing. They should be trying to tilt their opponents. They should be trying to get in their heads, and they should be trying to get opponents to punt off stacks to them.
Let me ask you this, Kane. And I don't know the answer to this, but it's a good question. Where do you think Phil Hellmuth ranks all time on who has played the most WSOP events?
I imagine nothing, as Kane thinks here.
I don't know how many. Do you know on the top of your head in like the early 90s, late 80s, how many WSOP events there were per year?
I don't know, but how many of those do you think Phil Hellmuth was playing?
I mean, he played a decent bit, right? But has Phil Hellmuth played more or less WSOP events than Alan Kessler? I'm not sure. Has he played?
There were 15 in 1990 to answer your question partially.
Okay, so now there are many more events. So has Sean Deeb played more than Phil Hellmuth? I mean, today Sean Deeb plays more than double Phil Hellmuth every year.
Phil Hellmuth won a WSOP main event while Deeb was in diapers. I mean, he was 12, but no, I'm just kidding.
Right. But there's so many more WSOP events.
I would be shocked. I would be shocked if Phil wasn't number one all time in WSOP events played, just because of the number of years and because of how important it was to him. And I would also not be shocked if he's played 10, 15, 20, 25% more than the next guy. It's going to be something like that. He plays a ton of events every year, and he has for all of these years. And I'm not trying to take away from the bracelets; it's impressive. But if we narrowed it down to bracelet per event, I mean, I'm killing Phil Hellmuth here. I'm destroying him. Just pointing it out.
Sure. No, that's true. But you don't have the sample size to point to that not being variance. I do think Hellmuth does.
Oh, it was variance. It was definitely variance.
You won the 1K turbo, so definitely variance.
But Doug, in your opinion, is it variance for Hellmuth?
I don't think it's variance for Hellmuth. In fact, one of the arguments you make for Hellmuth is that we have really gone through a lot of the variance here by having so many decades of playing every WSOP event, right? Absolutely. The guy is extremely talented in small to mid stakes, big field tournaments, no doubt. Probably the best ever at that. I don't think that there's really much of an argument for anyone else. I mean,
he also has the best results in the televised heads up sit and goes of any player of all time, right? He also is at the very least a winner in the cash games that he plays off the felt. So
yeah, he is. He's definitely winning in those games too, for sure.
We're talking about somebody who makes consistent money playing poker, who's a winner. He's not the best cash game player of all time, right? But he probably is the best live tournament player of all time. And he has the best results in heads up sit and goes. I don't know. I think that gives you a very, very strong argument.
I don't know if I would say so definitively best live tournament player of all time. And I want to point something out here for the chat. Part of this as well is we have to take sides and argue about this. I have already said I think Phil Hellmuth is in the top 20. I understand that what he's done is extremely impressive. He has the most WSOP bracelets. That's extremely impressive. So I'm not here just hating on your guy Phil. Okay, I already can see the comments. People are like, banging at the gate. But we have to argue both sides here. We have to argue what some of the arguments would be. So some of that is what is happening here. I did want to make one last point, though, one that he's winning in cash games off the felt. I think that's certainly true. But what lineups is the guy playing in? Because Phil Hellmuth is a notorious networker schmoozer getting into all of these billionaire type games. And yes, he's beating, I'm sure he's doing great in the games he's playing with Chamath and Jason Kalkunis and those guys. I bet you Phil Hellmuth he's just killing it. How much do we want to add that into his credit for thinking about best poker players of all time?
Right. I mean, something we haven't discussed here that we did discuss for a lot of the other guys and a lot of the guys specifically who are in contention for that number one spot is, would their peers consider them one of the best or the best player, one of the toughest players, right? If we ask Hellmuth, even at his peak, right? If we ask his peers, hey, who are the 5 guys you don't want at the poker table? How often is Hellmuth's name on that list? My intuition is it's not on that list, right? My intuition is that he's not one of the most feared players in the game in any period of time among the top players at that time, and that's definitely a knock against him.
Yeah, fair point.
Moving on.
All right. Yeah, let's move on to our 5th person from the top 20, Johnny Chan. To Phil Hellmuth beat heads up in the 89 main event, I believe.
I actually think this is one of Kane's favorite players. He has 2 main event championships in the WSOP. So, Kane, why don't you kick us off?
If we want to talk about name recognition being a big part of why people made this top 20, I think Johnny Chan is a good one to point to. Johnny Chan, in my opinion, should not be in the top 20 here. The reason why is because he's one of these guys, again, who benefits from name recognition, specifically in rounders, right, which kind of put him up as a poker god, right? But he did win 2 consecutive WSOP main events, which is very impressive. That was in the years of 87 and 88. The first year, there were 152 entrants, so not super tiny. In the second year, 167. He has 10 total WSOP bracelets, and that's no small feat. He's tied for second of all time. He has 8.7 million in live tournament earnings, and he was still a solid cash game player. The reason why the difference between Hellmuth and Chan, why I think Hellmuth belongs on this list and Chan doesn't, is just simply Chan is just generally behind Hellmuth, right? Even though he does have 1 more main event championship, he only has 10 WSOP bracelets. Even though that's tied for second of all time, Hellmuth has 6 more than that, right? He's 127th on the all-time earning list. Hellmuth was 18th, right? So in my opinion, Johnny Chan is like, you know, a weaker version of Phil Hellmuth. He doesn't deserve to be on the top 20 list, in my perspective, but he's certainly, you know, he's certainly a historic, iconic name of poker, but I don't think he should be in the conversation for best of all time.
Yeah, I mean, him being directly comparable to Phil Hellmuth in such a stark way definitely hurts him here. Quick question for you, Kane. You talked to that poker historian. Did he have anything to say about Johnny Chan? Because I've kind of heard some stuff about him where it was almost like he was the Phil Ivey of his era, is what I heard from some people. Just like he did have that mystique, that aura for many years, perhaps. I'm assuming it was in the 80s and 90s. Just curious if the guy you talked to sort of had anything to say on that front.
I heard that Johnny Chan was a winning cash game player. However, I did not get the impression that he was, you know, back when Phil Ivey was, you know, at his peak, right? People did not want to play against Phil Ivey in any form of poker. Johnny Chan actually does have versatility in the games that he will play, right? But my impression was that he was not elite at any of those games. And while he was a solid winning cash game player, winning reg, he wasn't going to be on your short list of guys you don't want to play against.
I think the best moment of Johnny Chan's career to get him into the top 20 here was the day that Matt Damon decided to play the hero of rounders. And if that day doesn't happen, there's just no way that Johnny Chan is in this top 20. He's only here because of how iconic he is. He's done a lot for poker in general. He is one of the biggest names. Obviously, a little bit of some scandalous stuff in the last year with what happened at his poker room and not paying out the players. But Johnny Chan is a true legend of poker, and no one can take that away from him. No one can take away what Johnny Chan has meant to the game of poker. But in terms of being a top 20 poker player, I simply just don't see the argument. I agree with the Phil Hellmuth comparisons. In what way has Johnny Chan differentiated himself in a way that puts him above Hellmuth? I can't think of a single way. There's just basically no way. So I can't see how you can rank him over Hellmuth. And then, you know, even Hellmuth, of course, you had the drawback of tournament specialists, all those types of arguments. Johnny Chan's that and more as well. So I would agree with the assessments here. And I also wouldn't have Johnny Chan in my top 20, to be totally honest with you. I don't see why. I don't really see why. I mean, there's a lot of bracelets. If we're going strict bracelets, obviously he's in the top 20 for that. But outside of bracelets, what else do we have going here?
Well, the only thing is back-to-back.
Mike, mute your mic when you're not talking, because there you go.
Yeah, the only thing is back-to-back WSOP main event championships, and that's no small feat, right? But again, those type of things, you know, move the needle for me. Maybe 5 back-to-back championships might move it 10% for me. It's still not enough to bring Chan, in my opinion, into the top 20, and certainly not number 1.
Yeah, makes sense. I think we're good to move on here. If we're having trouble even making the pro argument, I don't want to spend too much time just bashing this guy. He is a legend of the game. So moving on to Daniel Negreanu, Kid Poker. Doug, why don't you kick this one off?
There's just so much to cover here. All right, well, I'll start with this about Daniel. He has the same attitude towards poker, I think, as a Seidel, where he's constantly trying to improve his game and get better. Of course, he played versus me in our Heads Up Challenge, but he's also played a lot of other forms too. He has played cash games, has played some mixed games, primarily plays tournaments, but I wouldn't pigeonhole him into just being a tournament player. 6 WSOP bracelets, very impressive. I guess what I would say about Negreanu is there is a consistency to how many years that he has competed in the upper echelon. And I also think that while I'm sure the elite poker players of the world don't view Negreanu as a really strong player, at least it was like that for many years when I was playing poker at a high level. Unlike a lot of the older guys that just sort of laid down and died and just basically tried to cover their ears and close their eyes and just pretend that new solutions don't exist, he's definitely embraced those styles and tries to add it into his game today, which has allowed him to sort of move into the new era of poker in a way where he really could be profitable in a lot of these higher stakes tournaments that guys like Hellmuth just simply can't do. So I think when we look at the length of Negreanu's career, the success he's had in all forms of poker, and the fact that he has just been between a decent to good player or great player at all points, I think he's absolutely a slam dunk top 20 and should be high on the list.
Totally agreed. Negreanu is one of the best poker players of all time, if not the best. He should be a strong consideration for number one, largely because of his staying power, his versatility, basically everything we've mentioned as something that is a strong quality to make you a consideration for number one. He checks every single box, right? He's competed at a number of different games, at a number of different formats, right? He's been in a number of televised sit and goes where he's had success. He obviously is known for tournaments, but then he's also played a bunch of cash games. Prior to playing You Heads Up, he did an online Heads Up challenge. Now, he of course didn't win that one either back in the day, Doug. I'm sure you remember that, but he played a bunch of regs at the time, and he was playing decently, right? I mean, he at the very least, he was not a big fish, right? He was a spot, right? He was losing a couple big blinds per 100, I think. And then you were arguing with Negreanu at the time about whether or not he'd be profitable in 6-max no limit hold'em, and of course he never took you up on that bet, right? But he did jump into those ring games, and he was like a 2.5 big blind per 100 loser in those games, right? Which is not a very big loser. So that means that he was at least somewhat competitive with the best players in the world at a game that was not his preferred game at that time, where he didn't put any work in. So in my opinion, this guy's mined for poker. And if you look at everything combined, if you look at the totality of all the circumstances of everything that he's achieved, of everything that he's good at, I think he's a very strong argument for the best player of all time.
I guess so if we're going to go to drawbacks here for Negreanu, I think one of them would be a lot of people would view him as, at least at the top level, as maybe a jack of all trades, but a master of none, where if you looked at high rollers, a lot of the high roller regs are better than him. If you look at the cash games he played, the players that he played at the high levels are better than him. If you look at bracelets, there are a bunch of people that have won more bracelets despite him playing tons and tons of those events. If we look at mixed games, I don't think he has that much of a history there, but there's obviously way better candidates for mixed games. So maybe the knock against Negreanu is that, yeah, he's done a lot of impressive stuff for a very long time, but at the actual top level in these top games, which games is it that people are afraid, oh, Negreanu is here, that's bad for me? Are there any games like that? Or is he always someone where you're like, okay, that's either whatever or good for me or whatever it might be?
No, I think that's fair. I mean, one of the questions, you played some high rollers for some period of time, right? How would you compare Negreanu being at your table in one of those events versus a guy like Seidel, who we went through earlier on this list?
I think, and this is a few years ago now, obviously I've not played high rollers in the last few years, but the general opinion of most of the high roller regs was Seidel was a little bit of a weaker reg, but winning and not someone that you're super happy is in the field. Now you're not super upset either, but of that era, he was basically the worst player. He's the player you'd want least of all the people that are kind of in that slightly older era. Negreanu was definitely viewed as one of, if the weakest regs, if not a spot in a lot of those high rollers during that period of time. But I also do think that was before Negreanu had really learned about some of the tools and kind of updated his game. So I don't think that would be the same today. Maybe that's not true. I'm just not as plugged into that community. But at that time, for sure, he was viewed as one of the weakest players in those fields.
Based on what those high rollers say publicly, which granted could be a little bit of a diplomatic type stuff that they're saying, but they've been giving him a lot more respect recently in general. I remember Justin Bonomo, I believe, had a line that was like, oh, wow, Daniel bluffs now. This is going to be a lot tougher, like something like that. What were you going to say, Kane?
Didn't Negreanu at one point propose to you, Doug, to crossbook in high rollers?
I don't remember, But the thing about cross booking and high rollers is they're already high rollers. So the stakes are already massive. And so I'm not afraid to say that for most of my career, the vast majority of my career, probably up to the last few years, if I played a 100K, I was going to have to sell a lot of my action. Just was the reality of the situation.
Right.
So when
But what I'm
wants
saying
to cross
is
book in a $25,000 tournament, can I really afford to? Would I do it small on the side? I guess, but then I already have so much at stake.
Right. So it would make sense for you to not take that action, but for there not to be a market for that action in general, right? I think says something.
Well, Negreanu has bet on himself against the people many times. Obviously, our challenge, but then also versus Hellmuth, he was cross-booking away. Didn't go great for him, considering he lost every single match to Phil Hellmuth, which, by the way, had to be devastating. You've practiced all this stuff. You've spent all this time learning. You got these new tricks. You got all these tools, and you go in, and some guy that just yells white magic and is out there just
limp folding ace jack.
Yeah, to opens, limp folding or to ISOs.
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually it's funny you brought up Hellmuth, because if you talk to people about whose game they respect more, Doug, obviously you could speak to heads up. You know, who do you think's a better heads up player between Negreanu and Hellmuth? I don't think there's really a question at this point that Negreanu is a much stronger heads up player. But then if you look at results, it tells a different story, right? Hellmuth is the undisputed GOAT when it comes down to WSOP bracelets, when it comes down to results. He's winning all these heads up sit and goes, whereas Negreanu has no wins to speak of. Other than back in the day, I can't say Negreanu was an ambassador at the win, and he basically challenged the world to heads up in a bunch of different forms, and Barry Greenstein played him, and I think they basically split games. I think it was pretty much 50-50 between the two of them. But the bottom line is that when Negreanu has engaged in these challenges, right, he hasn't won. Whereas Hellmuth seems like the guy never loses.
There is a mystique to Phil Hellmuth when it comes to this, and somehow we're back on Phil Hellmuth.
Yeah, such a mystique that we're right back to him. Yeah.
I mean, look, like you have to. The reality is we're going to have to compare Phil Hellmuth to Daniel Negreanu and talk about pros and cons to some extent. So whether we do this here on Negreanu or on Phil, it doesn't really matter. Phil wins. And if you're just a strict, I wanted just the guy that wins, then he's won more stuff when it comes to just winning tournaments, winning heads up matches, winning those types of things. But if we look at the actual quality I played versus Phil on high stakes poker last year, that was, I mean, one of the worst hands anyone's ever played at high stakes poker. It was horrific. He opened queen 10 off in early position. LOL that. And not, I mean, look, you want to play loose, that's fine, but that's a terrible open. And then he gets check raised on a board where he flops not straight, and he just jams 100K over a check raise. It was a monster jam. I mean, what is the guy doing? That's the kind of hand you would see someone that just started playing poker play. You'd see a hand like that, right?
Right.
Negreanu would never, ever, ever, ever play something like that. He would never make a mistake that bad. So
yeah,
it is tough because you're like, well, Phil's winning. It's like, well, yeah, but then I can point to all these hands where Phil does things wrong. I think the thing that Phil has to do, Phil has to really be in tune with some element of live reads that we just don't really understand. That he understands what's going on in some spots that I think Negreanu doesn't have, because clearly when Negreanu knows what someone has in a game, he calls anyway, as he's well known from high stakes poker in the past having done. So that might be the difference. But in terms of level of play, I mean, who's going to argue that Negreanu is a worse today, poker today, or maybe even over their entire career? Who has been better at playing poker? It has to have been Negreanu, right?
For hands you can point to, I think that's pretty clear. The one thing that I always think about guys like Hellmuth, though, it's a weird question. Does he win in spite of those blunders, or because he's taking those huge shots, hugely unorthodox plays, and then he's winning because he makes those plays, but then as a result he looks very silly sometimes? It's kind of hard to say. What do you guys think about that?
I think that we're going to be very, very biased towards. So, okay, so let's take a step back. Let's just pretend poker had just started and we were running the whole thing back, and it'd be new people, it would be new cards, new runouts, everything would have been different. Do I think Phil Hellmuth is where he is today? I think because of his dominance in the 80s and 90s in those tournaments, he's probably somewhere close, but I don't think he gets nearly as many accolades as he ends up getting because he was very fortunate with the way he ran in a lot of important situations. Do I think Daniel Negreanu gets to where he is? I think he does, roughly. So I guess part of the way I look at it is if I took everything away and we ran it back, do I think these guys get to where they are? I think Phil Hellmuth has been, I hate using this word, but I think he's been very lucky over the course of his career to get a lot of the wins that he's gotten, especially in some of the spots where he's been quite clearly an underdog.
Yeah, final couple things about Negreanu that separates him from Hellmuth in my view, because I do think both of these guys certainly deserve to be on this list, and I think both are in the conversation for the best player of all time, but I'm giving the nod to Negreanu. And a big part of the reason why is in those televised games, right, those high-stakes poker games, Negreanu showed up more, and he was a stronger competitor than Hellmuth. He was a bigger winner in those games. In the cash games, right, we're talking about how both of them win on the side games. I think Negreanu is a stronger competitor there. And then the one thing that's on our screen that we haven't even mentioned, 2 WSOP Player of the Years. I don't think Hellmuth had any WSOP Player of the Years. That's definitely something to be considered, and it speaks to the versatility. And again, Doug and I kind of butt heads on how important that is. But for me, if you're going to be considered the best poker player of all time, right, your ability to compete in many different forms of poker, in many different games, it's very, very important. And Negreanu, although he's not one of the best in the world at mixed games, right, he's winning in those WSOP events, and he has won WSOP Player of the Year twice. And in fact, he went online, and if you don't believe he's winning in those events, he sold his action for the WSOP. It sold out in like 3 seconds and crashed the website, and he made a ton of money for everybody who bought his action in those events. So I think that's a very strong argument for Daniel.
Yeah, fair. All right. On that note, let's move on to Ike Haxton. Love the WNBA on Full Tilt, one of my favorite screen names of all time, and Phil Ivey 2694 on PokerStars. We have some stats up on the screen for you here. One that I am going to read out, 1.4 million in profit, 9.6% ROI at a 4K average buy-in since 2020. He's played a huge sample of tournaments since about May 2020 on GG Network. And he's had some really, really solid results against really tough competition. What do you guys think about Ike making this top 20?
I think he's certainly a deserving player if we look at poker ability. If we're just strict, how good are people at poker today? He's probably top 5. Very smart guy. Great approach to learning the game of poker. He's going to be difficult to beat in almost any game he sets his mind to. I don't know if I would say he's as naturally talented as some of the other people on this list. I think he's more of like a work guy versus a natural talent guy. I don't think that he's someone that has the mind for poker like maybe some of the other people on this list. But the thing that's great about Ike is that he's just simply not going to allow himself to be a spot for a long period of time. One of the drawbacks I will say to how Ike plays is I've played Ike a lot. I've played Ike in tournaments. I've played Ike in heads up cash. Of this top 20, Ike might be the person I have played most. Is that the truth? That might be up there. One thing that I will say about how Ike plays is I think that he gets a little bit stuck in his ways if he views something as being correct. Like an example that I have, and I know we're getting extremely granular, but I feel like I can because I've played Ike a lot, is when we would play heads up, Ike had this thing where he would 3-5 small pocket pairs for just like forever. He did it over and over and over again. And it became kind of a meme in the heads up community because he just would do it so much. And I don't know why he thought that was right, but it went on for such a long period of time. Clearly, he thought that was correct and he was trying to implement it. So he obviously had learned that somewhere, right? It's not like Ike he started playing heads up. Oh, low pocket pairs. These are amazing to 3-5, right? And he would just do that. So one of, I guess, the criticisms I would have of Ike is some of the things that he would do that he had learned along the way, I think were not particularly good. I saw some of the cap matches against Isildur back in the day. I feel like some of those ranges were messed up. I also feel like when I've played live tournaments with Ike, he's been pretty spewy. And over my time period playing live poker tournaments, I think a lot of people viewed him as pretty spewtastic. I remember one hand I specifically played versus Ike where I opened kings under the gun and it folded him in the big blind and he jammed 70 blinds over an open. This is in 2016, 2017. 70 blinds over a 2 point whatever blind open. And I called as a kings and he had pocket nines. But I mean, maybe that was fine. I don't know. I don't know what the equilibrium point is, but I do think that Ike has been a bit spewy in a lot of the formats that he plays, but he's a hard worker. He has continued to improve his game. He's very committed to playing poker. He plays tournaments. He plays cash. He's played heads up. He played PLO. I played a bunch of high stakes heads up PLO with Ike. We played some 100, 200. I was definitely outgunned in those matches, but I wanted to try and test myself versus somebody that was world class. The guy's played basically all of these formats. He's been a top player in all of them. And apparently he also won Super High Roller Bowl. So definitely definitely someone that should be in the top 20 and a good argument to be made for one of the best players of all time.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And adding to the versatility, he's a regular in Bobby's room. I mean, he plays mixed games. From what I understand, he plays them quite well. Not as well as the people who've been playing mixed games exclusively their whole life. But when you add that to everything else, playing heads up and six max and nine-handed, live and online, his results are very, very good. He's a very strong competitor, and I think that there's a very strong argument, number one, in my opinion.
Anything you want to add in here, Mike?
I think a lot of it comes down to, you talked about his work ethic, and then that work ethic has allowed him to have that versatility factor that we've talked about several times throughout this podcast. I mean, like Kane just said, he's regular in Bobby's room. He's good at the mixed games. He's good at the big bet games. He's played tournaments. He's played cash. I think that really comes down to work ethic. And yeah, that's why he made this top 20. On that note, let's move on to Fedor Holz, primarily tournament player here. What are your guys' initial thoughts on Fedor making this top 20?
I really don't think that he belongs on the top 20 list. I think that he has almost no cash game success to speak of in his background. I think that he had one of the most notable high stakes poker runs, high stakes tournament runs. And we see this every few years. Someone goes an incredible heater. Mike just removed himself. Maybe.
Yeah, go on. Just go on.
Every few years, someone goes on an absolutely incredible heater in poker tournaments. And we wonder, is this the best person of all time? Nope. This is how heaters work. I think he is a great tournament poker player. Certainly in the conversation for top 20 tournament players ever. But no mixed game experience, almost no cash game experience, no online tough game experience, really. What has this guy done other than one extremely hot run of tournaments where he won a couple high rollers and he's got 2 WSOP bracelets? Sure, that's something that you can bolster your resume with, but what does this guy really have to be in the top 20? I don't think that he should be here. And I like Fedor. He's a nice guy, but we're talking about all-time best poker players. Way too much of a one-trick pony, as you said before, Kane, and I don't think that he belongs.
Yeah, I got to agree with you. And especially if we're talking about the staying power, right? Fedor has kind of moved on to other things at this point. Prior to his big live tournament run, right? He was a good online poker player, but he wasn't considered one of the best. So outside of that brief little period, which was an insane brief period by any measure, right? There's not really too much to speak of with Fedor. I will say I did speak to Jonas Becker about Fedor. He provided this quote, and something interesting for us all to kind of think about and learn from is, Jonas really told me that one of what made Fedor great and what still makes him great is that, when he's thinking about a hand, or when he's sizing up his opponent, or the way that his opponent played a hand, or when he's at the poker table talking to even some amateurs or weaker players, right? He's just really trying to figure out the way that they think, right? He wants to know what they ate for breakfast. He wants to know why they're there at the World Series of Poker, right? And he's picking up on information that, most guys are not even thinking about, right? Certainly the guys who are sitting there, probably like me and you, Doug, thinking about theory and the GTO solution. Fedor didn't really care about that. He put that secondary. What he put as number one is I'm going to try to really put myself in this guy's head. And that's why, especially in these kind of larger field tournaments, he was able to have so much success.
Agreed. Also, Fedor is an extremely smart player. I would say, I guess I should say person. I think he's an extremely smart person. And I think his approach to poker, he has a really good understanding of the way that people respond to things and understanding the math of situations. And I do think that he is a great tournament poker player. But we're talking about the greatest poker player of all time. I just think you have to do more outside of that. And I don't think that's been the case.
Yeah, 11 million in online tournament cashes is impressive.
Yeah, that's a lot of online. But I think he won the Scoop main one year, right? Or WCUP main. I think Scoop main. Yeah.
Sounds right.
Yeah.
And he is 10th all-time live earnings. So, even if we're talking about best tournament player of all time, I do think Fedor's in the conversation. Again, then the knock is maybe the staying power. But even then, his results kind of speak for themselves, right? But back to your original point, it's really just no limit hold'em tournaments. And when we're talking about the best player of all time, I don't think that's going to cut it.
All right, well, some solid consensus there. Let's go ahead and move on then.
Guys, so I thought about this. I would like to recuse myself for this segment and leave it to you two, because I just feel like it's just too unfair for me to have to argue pros and cons against myself. I don't. It's funny though, so we can go either way. What do you think?
Maybe abstain for the beginning, and then you can kind of give us your final take. Put a bow on this section once Kane and I have fleshed it out a little bit.
Okay, go for it.
All right, Kane, you want to take the pros?
Sure. So obviously, as we can see on our screen, 3 WSOP bracelets. And as Doug mentioned earlier, considering the number of WSOP events that he's entered, that's a huge accomplishment. This is a guy who's basically won every single heads-up challenge that he's ever had. The first one against Sauce, who was one of the best, perhaps considered the best at the time. Doug came out and announced publicly that Doug is in fact the best heads-up player, and then he backed it up. And in addition to backing that up, he backed up the truck against Daniel Negreanu, won a huge heads-up match there. He was one of the most feared heads-up players in the world, and he ventured out of No Limit Hold'em from time to time. As he said, he played Ike in heads-up PLO, so he was battling some of the stronger players in the world at games other than No Limit Hold'em. He, I believe, won a decent bit against Sean Deeb heads up in mix. Or Doug, maybe you can jump in right now and tell me.
I played a chunk of heads up 8 game. It wasn't. I played Deeb only a couple sessions, but I played some 3K 6K heads up in Bobby's heads up 8 game. Yeah, briefly.
Yeah, I got some points. I got some points for and against. So some points for is when it comes to big bet games and really No Limit Hold'em in particular, Doug has been really, really good at basically every form of it. He obviously was a heads up specialist. He did great in live tournaments. He did great in online tournaments as well. I mean, there are a couple stats not on the screen, but he won like a Party Poker 5K. That was a very tough field for something like 65 buy-ins or something, not a super small field at all. He also got second in a 10K scoop event. Again, very tough field. The final table was just like 7 of the best tournament players in the world, pretty much. But that's kind of where it ends, and that would be the argument against, is it's pretty much the major success. He's played some Ring, he's played some PLO, he's played some mix, but it's basically all been No Limit Hold'em, and in particular heads up. And then when it comes to the success outside of heads up No Limit, it's been relatively small sample sizes in tournaments. So I think that kind of makes it's kind of an argument for and against at the same time, right? Like he's had success in this small sample, but he's also only had that small sample. And then when Doug has ventured out into, PLO and 08 and these mixed games, I don't think he's necessarily gotten destroyed, but it certainly wasn't lucrative enough for him to continue pursuing that path.
Yeah. For me, Doug just doesn't have the versatility to be on this list. Again, if we're talking about the best heads-up poker player of all time, Doug should absolutely be on that list, and he's a strong contender for number 1. But if we're talking about the best all-around poker player of all time, I agree. Doug just hasn't shown the live consistency and staying power, right? I don't know if Doug, how profitable Doug is at live cash games. I don't know if Doug's ever played sit and goes, for example. Outside of No Limit Hold'em, he doesn't have that much experience. And again, he hasn't had the staying power, right? Doug is a professional one day, the next day he's retired, then he's challenging somebody to a heads-up match. I mean, he hasn't had the staying power to be around. Excuse me. If we're talking about an iconic name in poker, Doug changed the poker landscape, right? I'd say, I'm only saying this because Doug's here right now and he's going to hate it. He's similar to Tom Dwan in that way, right? He's somebody who just came in, changed the poker landscape. He has a poker training site. He taught people how to play poker with his videos. But if we're talking about the best player of all time, he just hasn't been around long enough, and he doesn't have the versatility. I don't think Doug should be a contender for number 1. I wouldn't have put Doug in my top 20.
Yeah, fair enough. So, Doug, with all of that said, is there anything you want to address? Anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I would just say a few things, some for and against on myself. So for starters, I would agree that I just don't think that I've played poker long enough. And I think that one real difference from me, from a lot of people on this list, maybe everyone on this list, or almost everyone on this list, is I just didn't have the drive to keep playing for a long period of time. I just kind of hit this point where I just didn't really want to keep playing that much. And even today, a lot of my play is to promote my businesses, or, because I know like members of my site or my club or whatever want me to play. So I play now because it's important to do so, but not because I really love playing. And I think that that's just hurt me pretty tremendously when it comes to trying to put together a resume that's going to last decades. It's just simply not going to happen for me. My play is going to go down. I have not played much in the last few years, and it's probably only going to go down from there. So I think from a consistency and length of career, I just don't think that puts me in that echelon. I will say that Heads Up No Limit is basically the toughest form of poker to play in terms of having to play at the highest level and constantly having to make good decisions against people that are trying to take every dollar you have. And so I do think that Heads Up poker should be viewed in a way that I don't think it quite gets the respect that it deserves. Lord knows if 6 max on stars isn't getting the respect it deserves, Heads Up isn't going to as well. But I really was the best Heads Up player for a good number of years there, with many people trying to take me on, and I fucked them up. So it actually got to the point where when I backed my team of people and taught them Heads Up, my team became basically the best Heads Up players afterwards, and people wouldn't even play Dog or some of the other guys as well. So I think I absolutely put those streets on lock. I think I had some versatility. I played a large number of tournaments live and online. Both went insanely well. My win rates in big blinds per 100 online tournaments was incredible. But the reality is I ran super, super, super hot in tournaments. I won a ton of them for how few that I played. It was certainly not a fair number. And I just don't think that I have sort of the resume that makes sense outside of a lot of the online cash game stuff. But I do think that the online cash games should be weighted more heavily than I think people today weight them.
Yeah, fair enough.
Makes sense. Yeah, best Heads Up No Limit Hold'em poker player of all time, probably, in my opinion, if that were what we're coming with. I think the other thing to consider is, again, we've talked about this with other people. If you're going to talk about who are the guys you don't want to play against in a ring lineup, right? I don't think Doug Polk comes to anybody's head, right? Even though he is a strong competitor, right? And even though people would expect for him to have the poker mind to be good at 6 max, he just hasn't put in the reps at 6 max for him to be on that list, right? Whereas if you're talking about who you do not want to play Heads Up, specifically in No Limit Hold'em, right? Doug was number 1 when he was the best, and probably still is one of the top people today, right? And even before Doug was the best, he was one of the best, right? So I think in that regard, basically, again, amazing Heads Up, specifically No Limit Hold'em, but all forms of Heads Up player. But the 6 max, while he is a very strong poker mind, I just don't think he's really put in the time there.
He was, after all, voted the worst NL 200 reg on 2+2 back in 2008. So that is definitely another point against in the ring world.
Man, my full ring strategy from back in the day, that thread on 2+2, who's the worst full ring reg, and it was me and 3 other regs, and I won, and it was before anyone knew who I was. People just saw my name, like, oh my god, WCG Brady, that guy is horrible, and everyone just voting for me. My strategy was people folded the blinds too much, so min raise every button, and then after that, only put money in with sets. Anywhere.
That sounds like some 2007 poker stuff right there.
Top pair was not a betting hand. That isn't even a set. It's good times.
All right. If you want any more advanced strategy like that, check out upswingpoker.com. And with that, let's move on to Patrick Antonius.
Brady, we should maybe do some ads for Upswing that aren't just tongue-in-cheek, Doug's bad at poker. You know, once in a while, maybe that would be good.
Doug, I think the audience would agree we've done plenty of Upswing poker ads that are serious. If they've been watching you for a few years. All right, so on to Patrick Antonius. We've alluded to him a few times today. Definitely a legend of the game. I mean, he's one of those poker, kind of late poker boom guys that was considered one of the best players then. I kind of always remember him being sort of, it was him and Phil Ivey were like the two kind of guys that were on a pedestal over everyone else. So what do you guys think Patrick Antonius making this top 20?
I think I'll kick us off here, Kane. So I think that Patrick is a bit of an interesting one because I feel like he's so unique compared to the rest of the list. He's had a lot of success in different areas. He's been a good online player. He's been a good live player. He's been a decent tournament player. He's been a good cash game player. So he's played all kinds of different games. Of course, a lot of PLO as well as No Limit. I'm sure he's played his fair share of mixed games. So when it comes to someone that has played in a lot of different areas, definitely one of the best. I also think that Patrick had an extended period of time where he was viewed as one of the toughest players in many of the games that he was playing. He's also one of the all-time online cash game winners. I mean, $17 million just on high 6DB from when he was playing on full tilt. Incredible amounts of money being won the online felt, even though it was during an easier time period with Gilles Berthet and whatnot, but still incredible number of winnings, lots of heads up, lots of shorthanded. So when I look at someone like Patrick, I think he's definitely a top 20 all time. Kind of my issue with Patrick has been in the last, let's just say, decade. I really feel like his play has dropped off where he's not managed to play sort of a modern style in an era that demands it. And because of that, he's just kind of become a weaker reg in a lot of the lineups, and it hurts his ability to play in different areas. And I imagine it's been hurting his results over the last 10 years or something or so as well. And look, I know it's not the most fair that people that play in today's game have to update their style, whereas a lot of the guys in the older days didn't. But you know what? If you want to play poker in the 2020s, you're going to have solver-based inputs on the way that you play and approach the game, or else you're going to fall behind the curve. And I feel like Patrick is someone that he definitely belongs in the top 20. He's definitely an all-time great poker player. He had many years at the top, but I feel like his unwillingness to sort of embrace these styles and compete at the highest tiers is starting to hurt his ability to be on the greatest poker player list.
I agree with that. What's funny about Patrick is, you know, even though he's seen as more of a live player, his best accomplishments are online, right? Being the second biggest online winner of all time. A lot of that came from before Guy was even around, but he did make a lot in those Guy games as well. But I mean, back in the day, Fin to Grind was like the guy you didn't want to play online. So that's actually where he was most accomplished. And then his live play, he does well in live cash games. He hasn't had as much success in live tournaments. He is on a 71st all-time money list, right, which is good. But compared to some of the other old school guys who are on this list, right, Patrick doesn't have the same sort of live accolades that they have. He has no player of the years to speak of. We don't have a bracelet count on here.
Yeah, no bracelets.
No bracelets?
Yeah.
Wow, no WSOP bracelets.
It's not that surprising though, Kane. The guy doesn't play small stakes stuff, right? He's not going to play. I don't think he was playing 2K tournaments or a 3K tournament.
Right.
Fact checks. My mistake. There are 3. I assumed that because we didn't have it on the screen, it was 0.
Brady,
But yes, he does have
Brady,
3.
Brady, you really think he wouldn't have WSAP bracelets? I mean, the guy's a legend. Obviously, he won some WSAP bracelets.
I thought I vaguely remembered him being in the conversation for like best without a bracelet, but I just misremembered. I'm sure.
Yeah. So I think there are strong arguments for Patrick. I think the issue is really that, again, just when you compare him to the other guys on this list, he doesn't have the live tournament results. While he does play mixed games, those aren't his strongest games. He's not considered one of the strongest players in the Bobby's Room game. He plays there, and I've played against him, and I'm not one of the strongest players in those games myself. But I know that people aren't super concerned with Patrick these days. Maybe back in the day, he was considered more of a threat, but I think his specialty has always been in no limit hold'em and pot limit Omaha. We talked about the Durr challenge, and we talked about how Durr shouldn't even be on this list. Nonetheless, Durr beat Patrick heads up in the Durr challenge, right? So that's a big knock against Patrick. I think it makes sense for Patrick to be considered in the top 20. You know, if not the top 20, then the top 30 or 40 of all time. But I would not put him, in my opinion, as the number 1 player of all time. I don't think he should be in the conversation.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, with that, let's go ahead and keep the pace moving. We're on to Victor Blom, kind of an appropriate person to have after Patrick here. Our quote on Victor is actually from Patrick. I'm going to go ahead and read this one. He has a lot of talent. The hardest thing about playing against Isildur 1 is that he's constantly pressuring you to make huge decisions in every hand. Now, that's for better and for worse, right, Doug? Because I remember you playing Victor, and I remember you had some adjustments to your strategy that really took advantage of the fact that he was constantly pressuring.
I actually am realizing that I clearly have played more hands versus some people than Ike on this list, and Isildur is one of them. And then obviously Negreanu. I don't know what I was thinking with that one, but I think I've played. There's only a couple people I've played a lot of heads up in my life, and there's only a couple people I've played more than Isildur. I've played something like 15 or 20,000 hands versus Isildur, so over a good number of years. So I am very familiar with the way Isildur plays poker, and I have extremely good insight on his approach to the game. And just some of my general thoughts on him. Isildur is one of those players that has an A++ game and he has a D- game. And the real thing about Isildur was whether he was winning or losing. He was one of the streakiest players of all time. And the reason is that when he's winning, the guy is absolutely ruthless. He's just thinking, what's the next spot I can put you in? Is my opponent's morale low? Can I put him in this situation where, because he's questioning himself, he won't make the call? When he's winning, he's just, every single moment is, how can I win more? How can I win more? How can I win more? How can I get away from this spot that's bad? How can I get into this one that's good? And it is just devastating to play versus him when he's playing his A+ game. And when you got Isildur action online, you were kind of forced to play him no matter what. But man, you prayed he lost the first few binds out of the gate versus won a few, because if he won a few, he can just light you up. And the only person I've ever lost $1 million to in one day was Isildur. I lost $1.1 million to Isildur in a session when I was up in Vancouver. He absolutely just killed me. It was just a ridiculous beatdown.
What were the stakes of that game?
I think it was 400, 800.
Yeah, okay. So 80K buy-ins.
Yeah, you could buy in deeper too. That added to the variance. Okay, on the other side, when Isildur started losing, he would just kind of get into his shell, and you could tell the confidence was gone. And he's one of those players that's extremely, he ride or dies with his confidence and with his intuition. And his intuition when he's winning, it was so much more on point. And you could tell when he was losing, it was getting to him. He wouldn't make the same plays. He would play a little bit slower. He would play a little bit weirder. He would not make the same bluffs. He'd fold more. His stats would legitimately be different when he was losing. So if you opened up a session versus Isildur and you got him for a couple of buy-ins, it was just the chance he would dump a bunch of the account was high. So the swings were big, the wins were big, the losses were big. My thoughts on his game. I think that Isildur, one of the cool things about Isildur, and I guess Kane would view this as a negative, is that he is very willing to take unorthodox lines that put you in horrible situations. And not many people have the capacity to do that. When I played heads up versus Isildur and it started to get deep, he wasn't consistently making huge moves, but he definitely had it in him. And he put me in some of the most gross pots of online poker I've ever had to deal with repeatedly. A lot of them were versus Isildur because he would just pile in infinite big blinds in these crazy spots. However, sometimes he would do it with hands that were really, really, really silly. And I played one hand against him where we were 300 blinds deep or something, and it was a 3-bet pot, and he raised flop, bet turn, jammed river, and the board was like 10, 9, 8, 3, 6. And so the river made one to a straight. And I had middle pair open ender and I rivered a straight, and I called his jam, and he had pocket jacks. So an overpair that was, I'm not sure if he's bluffing or value betting. And so Isildur would make mistakes like that where his instinct was, I need to jam here, even though I don't know what he was trying to do there. Was he trying to get me to fold an over like aces, or was he trying to value bet a 10? To this day, I don't know what he was trying to do. Isildur's play style was not fundamentally sound. It wasn't technically sound. This guy was a warrior. He was a battler. It's why it was so fun to watch him play. It's why so many people to this day are Isildur fans, because you saw him run up and down huge stacks because he was just out there battling everyone. And to Isildur's credit, he played basically the best player in every game type heads up. So he'd play me heads up no limit. Then he would play whether it was Galfond or Sauce or somebody heads up PLO. Then he would play Volker heads up triple draw. Then he would play Sally Wu heads up 08. Then he would play every single person in every single game type at the actual highest stakes, the best opponent. Pretty fucking incredible that even though, yeah, he didn't win that much from that, he might have been a net loser in a lot of those games. The fact he was able to do that, how many people in the world could do that and not just completely wrecked?
It's crazy to imagine, like, because I think we've all had those moments, where you're like clicking around the lobby of a poker site and you're kind of just looking at what's going on, what you could play. But if I'm doing it, I'm looking at maybe playing some, 50-cent dollar triple draw or something like that. Isildur's doing this and then scrolling to the top of the lobby, picking the highest stakes game and playing the best player in that game. It's pretty insane. Kane, what thoughts do you have on Isildur here?
So I think it's interesting that a lot of the points that Doug made about Isildur, right, could also be made about Tom Dwan. But Doug had a little bit of a different spin on Dur, right? I mean, Dur would put you in really tough spots. He would play unorthodox. He would play based on whether he was winning or losing. And he would also battle people at different forms of poker at the top of the lobby. Why the negative interpretation of that for Dur, but you put a positive spin on it for Isildur?
Well, I also did bring that up as the positive for Dur. So that was one of my pros to Dur were those things. But I think that what it boils down to is the volume and the variety of game types, because Dur was losing at heads up in much smaller samples versus people in his main game. He mainly played no limit and he lost at that. Isildur played every single game type at the highest stakes online, basically, and held his own in a lot of them and beat people in a variety of those games. So, I guess the reason I look at it like that is the amount of different games that he played for how many hands he played, I think is much more impressive. The fact that, yeah, he didn't win money from that, but he didn't lose a bunch like Dur did. And he also played a variety of stronger opponents. I mean, yes. Look, Kane, I'm going to cut to the chase. Neither one of them's top 20. They're just not. He's simply not.
To me, winning money at poker is a prerequisite to being the best poker player of all time. And as a result, I can't, in good faith, put Victor Blom on this list. In my opinion, he shouldn't be considered for number one. He shouldn't be in the top 20. Might he be one of the most interesting people to have watched play of all time? Yes. Might he, in fact, have one of the best poker minds of all time? That might be the case, right? Just intuitive, no studying off the felt, no thoughts about game selection or anything like that. Might he just have one of the best poker mind? It's possible.
I would right? Word that differently, Ken. I wouldn't say poker mind. I would say hand reading ability.
Right.
He was a truly phenomenal hand reader, and there's one more hand reader we got left on the list that we're going to come up to at some point. But he is a phenomenal hand reader, and that really got him far in all of these game types. he quickly learned how to figure out what people are likely to have and put them on that. And it made him fierce when he was right and he was accurate and he was on. He just felt like he knew what you had a lot, and he did. That's what was tough about him. But no, I mean, look, the guy, he didn't play that much live. He didn't play, and this guy wasn't how to say that? I mean, look, I don't think Victor has been a winning poker player in his career. So how are we going to put him in the top 10 or 5 or 20? How did you guys vote him in here?
I think I know why they voted him, but it's hard to have a stronger argument than that against. I mean, you do have to win money to make the list. So on that note, let's go ahead and slide over to the Godfather, Doyle Brunson. Let's talk about Doyle. No doubt one of the most iconic poker players of all time, if not the most, certainly would be on poker's Mount Rushmore if there was one. Kane, thoughts on Doyle making this top 20?
Doyle absolutely belongs on the top 20. There's an argument that maybe he belongs on the top 10. I don't think he's my number one. The reason why is because from the people I spoke to, while Doyle originally, back in the day, Doyle basically was kind of considered a one-trick pony at No Limit Hold'em when he first started coming up, right? Which actually gave him a distinct advantage back then because a lot of money was moving back and forth in No Limit Hold'em, and nobody was that good at No Limit Hold'em. And Doyle was actually one of the best. But when he wrote Super System originally, right, he wasn't great at the mixed games. In fact, he had other people write the other sections. There was one section, I forget which one it was, that Doyle actually wrote a little bit on himself that had to be edited later because he wasn't as well versed in the limit games. Now, as his career has gone on, Doyle's actually gotten good at the limit games, but not at an elite level, right? He plays Bobby's Room. He's not considered one of the strongest players in Bobby's Room, although from what I do understand, he is considered very, very good at Raz today. He is one of the best, one of the top live Raz players, and I think Doyle has offered to play a number of top Raz players heads up, and not very many people in a live setting, and not very many people have taken him up on that. But obviously, one of poker's best of all time. From what I gathered, if you had to go through the old school guys, I still put Chip above Doyle for the best of all time, albeit Doyle much more iconic than Chip, right? If we're talking about who's had a bigger impact on poker in general, it's absolutely Doyle Brunson. But if you're just talking about who's the best poker player, right, I'm still going back to that 1974 and 75, I think it was, Chip winning $2 million back then. I mean, it's really hard to overcome that, right? And I think that everything that Doyle has done and that he represents puts him in the top 20, but not number one. Doug?
I don't have a ton to add. I agree with basically all of Kane's sentiment. I think that Doyle, one of the tough things about Doyle is he's played a lot of cash games. Definitely a Bobby's Room regular. How much poker of Doyle have we really gotten to see? And I don't feel like the answer is that much. So when I look at his tournament resume, it's fairly impressive for what he did at the time. It's very impressive. And if he had taken tournaments as serious as say a Phil Hellmuth, we could be looking at a situation where he has Phil's accolades instead of his own, because he's been playing poker the whole time, but he played cash games. And I know towards the latter part of his career, he's maybe some health stuff that went into why he didn't play tournaments as well. But I think very easily Doyle could have had Phil's results if he had played tournaments instead of cash games. So in a way, it makes it look bad for him. Oh, these are his stats when Phil has these stats. But the reality is that just could have been Doyle if he had stuck to that game type.
Yeah, I do think that the longevity, though, is really amazing. The fact that Doyle still today is competing in Bobby's Room, right, after so many years. I mean, if you want to talk about an Iron Man of poker, right, we put Seidel in there. We should totally put Doyle in that equation as well. Also, winning the main event back-to-back years is a huge accomplishment. It's not as big of an accomplishment, in my opinion, as when Chan did it, because the 2 years that Doyle did it, there were 22 entrants in 76 and 34 entrants the next year in 77. But a final thing that should be noted about Doyle is Super System actually really changed the way that people thought about poker. Because before Super System, at least all the strategy on No Limit Hold'em was very different than what Super System advocated. It was really the first poker learning tool to advocate aggression. at the poker table. Like, it's important to win pots at non-showdown, right? Was kind of like what Super System came up with, whereas before that, it was like, no, you just need to have it. You need to have the goods and wait for the goods, was kind of what all the training material was like before that. So iconic, probably top 10 or 20 poker player of all time. In my opinion, though, it's hard to put him number one.
Sounds like that training material before Super System was basically wait for a good hand and hope you're coolering someone. I do try to implement that strategy myself, to be fair. All right, we can go ahead and move on to Dan Cates, aka Jungleman.
I mean, this picture is just. Can we?
Let's go. Yeah, let's take another look.
Take a moment and appreciate what we're looking at here.
It really is.
That's a human being, Mike.
Debatably, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So, Doug has said that Jungle is one of the toughest opponents he's ever played. He's obviously got just that one WSOP bracelet, but it's a very impressive one, winning the 50K very recently, kind of proving, well, as much as you think proving is done with one tournament, proving that he belongs in the mixed game streets, is good at those games too, not just a big bet player. Doug, you want to kick it off here for Dan?
Sure. He should have been eliminated from that tournament, by the way. The fact that guy folded an ace was just criminal, but
we can put that aside.
I'll spare you. Yeah, I'll put that just to the side for a moment. When I was talking about Victor Blom being a great hand reader, the other person I was thinking about was Daniel Cates. Absolutely incredible knack for reading hands that put me in some of my all-time most horrible spots where I was bluffing and got picked off by just basically sandwiches. And one of the guys that's truly amazing at just knowing what people are kind of up to. What's this guy up to? What's that guy up to? What's his thing? Sort of classifying players in ways that make his decision making easier. And I briefly lived with Dan Cates in Vegas, and I got to see him play poker at some different times, and he just seemed to always know. As he would say, you got to know your foe. You got to know your foe. And he really seemed to know his foe at every opportunity. I think that I know he's had good success online. He's had good success in live. I think in tournaments, he's run into the kind of thing that a lot of heads-up players run into where they just are too loose and spewy. Now, it's much better to play tournaments than full-in cash because non-ante formats, you need to play extremely tight. And I think the transition from heads up to tournaments is an easier one. But at the same time, he was a little bit punty in a lot of those games that I think made him maybe a bit of a spot in some of the higher stakes tournaments at times. But understands the core concepts of balance, an all-time great hand reader, one of the best online poker players of all time. Some also reasonable success in live tournaments. And then, of course, the famous Tom Dwan challenge where I like how this says in the notes, essentially surrender. Yes, Tom Dwan had to essentially surrender in the most notable heads-up challenge of all time.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think Dan Cates absolutely deserves to be on this list. I think he's a strong contender for the best player of all time. If you're taking a look at versatility, right, Dan Cates is largely known as a heads-up player. However, recently he's a heads-up no-limit hold'em player. However, he's also very, very good at heads-up pot limit Omaha. And recently he's gotten into all sorts of mixed games. He's battled people in heads-up mix. He's been playing. He's a regular in Bobby's room these days. From my perspective, the big knock on Jungle is that while he does play live, he's not considered one of the toughest players in the live lineups as a result of live read type of things, which he doesn't believe in. But it also, from what I've heard, has resulted in him having legitimate live tells, which is rare for a professional in those games. But overall, if you're talking about one of the best poker players, one of the best poker minds of all time, I think Daniel Cates has to be on that list. For the con side, Doug, I know that you played him in heads up, no limit hold'em. Was that a challenge or was that just kind of you guys playing? I know you had good results against him.
No, you're wrong. He's my all-time worst opponent. My results versus Jungle are the worst of any. How did I think that I'd played more hands versus Ike than the rest of these people? This is ridiculous. I've obviously played more versus Jungle than Ike. Yeah, he's my number one all-time number. I mean, how to word this in English?
Biggest villain.
I've lost more buy-ins to Jungleman than anyone else I've ever played, and it's by an incredible margin. Now it's a little bit skewed because we had a couple of sessions where we played 12, 14, 16-hour sessions for tabling and never reset stacks. We played some incredible hands at those stack depths. So that is definitely skewing the data a little bit, but
so to your knowledge, has anybody taken to the streets with jungle at heads up and won?
I'm sure there are some people that have, just because you play enough opponents, you're going to lose to someone. And I want the record to show he actually quit me. He was killing me. And then I was like, all right, time for the daily battle. He's like, oh, I can't be, I'm doing something else. And then it was just, it's like, really? You're going to beat me for like 40 or 50 buy-ins and leave? Like, what the hell? You're done? I don't know. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
But I mean, the way heads up works is you're going to have people you lose to, even over
Sure.
big samples. You're just going to have the guys that just either run well versus you, or sometimes it's just they have your number. Like my style matches up really badly with jungle style because because he knows what I have in all my spots, which wasn't good.
That'll help.
Yeah, I think very, very strong contender for number 1, in my opinion.
All right,
actually, you know what? I'm kind of interested you say that, Kane, because while he's certainly a very talented player and deserves to be in the top 20, I feel like someone who's live, like you see this photo of him, he's one person not making a stupid fold away from that picture having to be something. What would it even be? What would that picture be instead? It would be, what would it be? I don't even know.
Ryan Lang, right?
For me,
no, I meant of jungle, Brady. What would the picture of jungle be?
What picture would we have chosen? Yeah, it certainly would have been this one. Yeah.
And
for me, in dubbing the best poker player of all time, while the tournament data is more easily retrievable, it is less important than whether or not they've dominated cash games, right? And the fact that Jungleman has dominated online cash games in a number of different types of cash games, right? I'm talking about No Limit Hold'em, Pot Limit Omaha, also some mixed games, but now is a regular in Bobby's room, where he's a winning player, perhaps not the best player at the table, right? But he's a winning player in those games, right? I think makes a very, very strong argument for his versatility. We have the data on Jungle's cash games, and that data is phenomenal.
Well, just a couple of counterpoints here then. So for live cash and live tournaments, for as long as I can remember, people have complained about his live tells, that he has a bunch of tells in a bunch of different spots. And I don't know if he, quote, doesn't believe in live tells, like you said, because people describe me like that, and that's sort of a misquote. It's more that I don't try and exploit those. I don't play like that, and instead I focus on trying to remove them from my own game. I don't know if he's the same way or not. I'm not sure what his opinion on that subject is. But for years, people have talked about how bad Jungle is playing live poker. And then his tournament resume, for the amount of tournaments he's played, the stakes he's played, isn't very good. He's won almost nothing. He would have no bracelets. He wouldn't have that photo. He would not have this one big win if that one guy didn't make a terrible fold when he had no chips. And then on top of it, you say he's won at all these reforms. Are we sure? Because I've played some ring games with Jungle, even online, and I think a lot of the regs viewed him as loose and kind of spewy, and well, they probably liked playing with me and him in the game. I'll tell you that much.
There were periods of time where Jungle was a loser in those games, and I was I was playing in some of those games where Jungle was like, I'm going to try to play 50-100 9-handed, and it wasn't good for the initial period of time. I mean, and it should be stated that it was like that for Jungle his entire career. The way his poker career got started is he was the legitimate biggest fish in his 1-2 game. He worked at McDonald's and would get his paycheck and go play in this game and just bust it every time, right? So Jungle he just has a way of jumping in to games, being a big fish, and then learning to get really, really good. And I do think that his live tells are a liability, right? But I think that that's a minor component. I think he's still winning, considerably winning in these live games that he's playing, despite the live tells. And again, I'm not saying that Jungle's one of the best players in Bobby's room at mixed games today, but the fact that he is on a short list of 10 guys who are playing the biggest stakes mixed games in the world is a huge factor, when you add it to the fact that he was the best heads-up no-limit hold'em player online for some period of time, right? And he was the best all-around heads-up player, perhaps still today. I don't know. Is anybody better than Jungle at every form of heads-up poker today?
What's that question? Is someone better than him at every form of poker?
Right. If you had to play Jungle
in each one, or as in
no. If you had to play
some.
every form of online heads-up poker, right? Is there anybody who is going to be a tougher opponent than Jungleman?
Man, I've played him in so many forms, and I still feel like I'm better, even though I'm down infinite. So I don't know.
But today, with you having been in semi-retirement for some time,
I mean, my heads-up game is pretty good right now. My heads-up no limit game. It's not top, but he's definitely in the conversation for one of the overall best heads-up players all time, if he's not number one. I don't know who I would take number two if we're going to include mixed games. We're going to include all this different stuff. I actually might take Jay Lama because I think in the heads up and the PLO, I think I would or the no limit and the PLO. I just call no limit heads up. I like that I do that in accident. But in mixed games, I'd for sure take Lama, and he knows a ton of different games. So he's also a very good poker player. But yeah, I mean, I like the respect that you're putting on the cash game elements and the shorthanded elements and the online elements. So I'm with you on all those. It's just, I feel like a lot of people are going to look at Daniel Cates and they're going to say, just didn't really do enough to make it into my top five. And I'm not totally sure. By the way, the conclusion of this podcast over the next week, I'm going to make my own list, including all names, 1 to 20. And I'm going to put a lot of thought into it. And because I see in the comments people that are complaining, Doug's just hating on everyone. Oh, Doug doesn't rate you either, huh? Yeah, well, this is the thing. This is what we have to do. We have to try and figure out who's better. And so that means we're going to critique people that aren't. I mean, earlier I said, peak LeBron isn't peak Jordan. Oh, now Doug thinks he's so good at basketball, he can critique LeBron. This is what we have to do, guys. This is the whole nature of lists, okay? But I do want to put together what I think my list would be, because it is interesting to think about how you would do it yourself, and I think you guys should both do it as well. It'd be fun to see your list
sure.
at the end too.
I will for sure. And if you're disagreeing with us super hard as we talk here, you're gonna get a chance to vote. So
yeah, you decide.
Voice it
guys.
then. Yeah,
you decide.
All right, so moving on, we got Justin Bonomo. This is actually going to be the guy who's highest on the live tournament earnings list, who's made our top 20. Bryn Kenny did not make the top 20. He's actually got Justin Bonomo pipped by kind of an incredible number, like $10,000 among 57.2 million. So Bonomo's just behind for live tournament all-time earnings. And he's competed at a very, very high level for a very long time, particularly in the high-stakes, super high-roller type tournaments. Kane, you want to kick us off here for Justin? What do you think?
So I think that Justin Bonomo is largely known today as a live tournament player, right? Because he had an amazing run in live tournaments. But back in the day when I was playing online, Z Justin was one of the most feared players. He wasn't perfectly fundamentally sound heads up, and a lot of heads up regulars would give him action for that reason, but he had good results, and it was always kind of inexplicable, and people didn't understand why. He also played six-handed online back in the day. He played tournaments online back in the day. I don't know to what success, but this is somebody who has been very successful at no limit hold'em in both online and live fields, and he went on one of the best tournament runs at all time. One of them was winning the heads up event, which is one of the toughest WSOP events, if not the toughest field WSOP event. Of course, there's a lot of variance in that. The knock on Bonomo would be that I don't know if he's played any mixed games. I don't know how much Pot Limit Omaha he's played, if any. Doug, can you speak to that?
As far as I know, he's not played those types almost at all. Although I'm not up to date in the last few years, I've kind of been out of the high stakes scene for a few years now. But my understanding would be over the COVID years, people probably didn't play a lot of other forms of at least live poker. But the thing about Bonomo, from my understanding and talking to some of the high stakes tournament scene, is that he is an extremely talented tournament player. He is one of the absolute best players. In fact, I'm going to say a quote from someone that I won't name, but they said, Justin Bonomo is one of my least favorite players. In fact, Justin Bonomo is my least favorite player to have at my table, partly because he's incredibly good, and partly because then you have to hear him talk. So it's sort of that 1-2 combo that really makes it pretty brutal to ever have him at your table. But anyway, as far as his poker acumen goes, this guy is an amazing tournament player. When you play with him, you can tell. It was years ago since I played a tournament with Justin, but I could just tell the thought that went into each decision, the commitment to trying to play poker at a high level, the ability to remove emotion from the game whatsoever. If I had to pick someone that has one chip or the most chips in the room, and they're still going to play the same, I would pick Justin. Such an even keel, constant analytical approach to the game of tournaments that it's not a surprise to me that he is one of the all-time leaders for earnings. I will say it's kind of funny when I look at blurbs like 25.4 million in 2018 alone. I actually view that as a negative, because tournaments are so luck-based that when someone just gets a big chunk of money in 1 year, what that says to me is they started winning tournaments, and when you're on a heater, you get to play everything, either through backing or whatever it is, shot taking, whatever you're doing. And then you won. I mean, so that 25 million, how much of that came from his 4 or 5 biggest scores? 80%, so, they won 4 or 5 tournaments in a stretch. Yeah, someone does that all the time. I mean, 25 million is a huge number, don't get me wrong, but I actually think that when it's over a longer period of time of sustained excellence, I think that means more than just one short stretch where you go on an incredible run. Regardless, very, very good case that Justin Bonomo is the best tournament poker player of all time, and tournaments are one of the most competitive formats, maybe the most, certainly up there. So what he lacks in these other areas, he certainly makes up for in his tournament prowess. And if we're not going to give people that play the most competitive formats and are the best some nod of credibility for that, then what this really turns into is this is a mixed game list of who plays the most games. And I don't think that's what a best poker player list should be.
No, I agree with that, but I think that the best poker player list should be a list of people who can branch out into other games, right? But have been particularly successful at one form of no limit hold'em poker, or one form of at least pot limit Omaha poker, right? And here we have an example of somebody who hasn't branched out into those other games. I would put him above, a good comparison here would be Justin Bonomo versus somebody like Federer Holz, right? Both of whom went through this amazing period where they just were kind of winning everything in live tournaments, both of whom are amazing live tournament players. But what's the difference? Justin Bonomo is still doing it, whereas Federer has kind of moved on to other things, right? And Justin Bonomo's has been more consistent, and Justin Bonomo has that added component of success in the online six max and heads up cash games as well. Of course, Federer had a lot of online tournament success that Justin hasn't really had as much. But I think it shows a little bit of versatility for Justin. Doug, did you ever play Z Justin heads up?
Yeah, he wasn't very good, but I think we should really focus on the tournament aspects here, because we're gonna put in his heads up no limit ability towards the end of him playing online and pair that with one of the most impressive tournament resumes of all time. We're gonna have to throw that. I view it as a drawback. I don't see a reason to.
Well, it's definitely something to consider.
Sure. I mean, the problem for him when he played heads up is he really loved overbetting in spots that weren't extremely good to overbet, and so it made trapping him too good in a lot of situations, because he was blowing the pot in some situations. But we didn't play that much. I didn't think he was a very strong heads up player. But then again, I didn't think almost anyone was a strong heads up player when I came through. So eat that, chat. But anyway, so yeah, that's my thought on the heads up aspect of it. I want to bring up this aspect, Kane, because this is kind of an interesting one. What are our thoughts on cheaters in poker? And there are certainly a number of people that will always hate Justin for the multi-accounting back in the day. Is there an amount of cheating that gets you off the list? What's the line on cheating? Because multi-accounting in a tournament online is cheating.
So we have a list. We're trying to come up with the best poker player of all time. So in my opinion, cheating on this list is only relevant to the extent that it has affected the person's results, and that we're basing them on those results because of their cheating, right? So we can have a different list of who we're saying who are the most ethical people in poker of all time that might look totally different than this list, right? And I think that's probably something that's also important to think about, or the people who are the biggest poker role models, right, in poker, or the biggest ambassadors of the game. But that's a different list, and in my opinion, to the extent that you cheat in any capacity here, it is relevant only to the extent that it affects your results, and that your results came as a result of that cheating.
Man, you really are a baseball fan.
I do agree with Kane there, though, because I mean, the stats we have up on the screen and what we've been talking about around Justin is his live tournament success primarily, though he did have that online success too, and the multi-accounting had nothing to do with that. So I don't think it should really detract from this discussion. It's not like we're citing those multi-accounting results as, you know, Justin's reasons for deserving to be in this top 20.
Yeah, and I think it's you know, we don't want to kind of bias people here in bringing this up just when we're talking about Bonomo, right, Doug? I mean, there are other people.
Well, I mean, I think about people
things,
like Doyle,
right,
or people like that, where there's some fairly credible cheating allegations that, you know, maybe haven't made the main surface, but that should probably have some kind of impact.
It has an impact to the
question is
extent
what?
that it's affected the results. And here, I don't think that any of this 57.2 million in live tournament earnings came from anything that anybody could point to as cheating, and therefore it's totally legitimate. It's also good to put in context that back in the day when Z Justin was multi-accounting, a lot of people were multi-accounting, and it's become obviously much more rare today as it's become a bigger deal to a lot of people. And I think that if you talk to Justin, he would disavow what he did back in the day, and have a very strong position that he doesn't do it anymore.
For the record, I'm not saying he shouldn't be on here because of his multi-accounting in a $100 tournament online 12 years ago. I'm just asking us to mentally think about what is our line and why, basically. But I think you answered that well.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, let's move on. We've got 6 players left, I believe. 5 left. And we're on to Phil Ivey, who you've all been waiting for. An absolute legend. 32.3 million in live tournament earnings. Really hasn't played like that many super high rollers and stuff too. Not nearly as many as a lot of other people on this list. Tied for second all-time WSOP bracelets. 9 WPT final tables. All of those sort of traditional poker accomplishments that people like to talk about, Phil Ivey just has an absolute boatload of them. So, Kane, what do you think about Ivey's chances of being the #1 best poker player of all time?
It's tough. It's Phil Ivey and, in my opinion, 19 other guys who we're gonna need to be looking for arguments as to why they're better than Phil Ivey, right? Because in addition to the accomplishments on paper we have here, 11th all-time live tournament, second in bracelets. We have the most online, right? Ivey is not even known as an online player, but I think it's Ivey and then Patrick, and then there's a pretty huge gap after those two with the most online winnings. But then in addition to all that, during Ivey's peak, right, he was the one guy that if you ask anybody, you wouldn't want to have Ivey at your table, right? Not among the online guys. When Doug and I were playing, I don't think we would have said that Ivey was the one guy we don't want at our online table, even though he was winning the most money. We probably should have said that, right? But certainly the live guys at all forms of poker, right? It doesn't matter what you're talking about. If you're talking about a horse lineup, if you're talking about a straight 7-card stud game, if you're talking about no limit hold'em, right? Ivey was the guy who you didn't want at your poker table, and it was pretty much consensus for a number of years. And I think that's the most important point, is not any of the points on this screen, but instead that for a period of 5 to 10 years, right, all the top players in the world just didn't want to play against Phil Ivey in any form of poker.
It's a strong argument. What's interesting about Phil Ivey is you can make extremely strong arguments like the one you made, but then when you look for weaknesses, he's just got all of the areas covered. You want to talk about online? Well, was the biggest online winner over his time period playing on the games at full tilt that was tracked by HSDB. He won 19 million online. You're talking about tournaments then? Oh, he's only a cash game guy? Nope. He's got 10 bracelets. He's got 32 million in earnings. So, it's one of those things where you want to point, okay, well, he doesn't play heads up. Nope. Played a bunch of heads up as well. He doesn't play ring. He plays ring. He plays live. He plays private. He plays public. He plays tournaments. He plays everything. So you kind of can't really find great arguments, I think, by trying to dissect where he isn't good. What I can say is that I do think that there is a little bit, and I can already tell the chat's gearing up for this one, guys. Get ready. Get your pitchforks out. I will say one of the things I think about Phil Ivey is I do think that he's another player where the game has passed him by. And he has not managed to keep a style up to date that makes him a strong player in today's world. If I look at Phil Ivey over the last 5, 6, 7 years, what games is he playing in that he's a good player, a good solid winning player in? What games is he feared in? What games, he played a lot of guys heads up 8 game online 5, 6, 7 years ago, got destroyed by a lot of them. He lost a bunch of True Teller, as far as I understand, playing heads up 8 game. What games is Ivey playing today that he's even feared in? Because as far as I'm concerned, basically any elite player in almost any of these game types would love to have Phil Ivey at their table. They view that as one of the people they would hope to be there. High stakes tournament guys, you think the high roller guys, you think that they'd be, oh no, Phil Ivey's at my table? No, he'd be the spot in the high roller scene. You think that the high stakes cash game guys online would be like, oh no, Phil Ivey's here? No, he'd be the spot in those. You think that, name the game where Phil Ivey is still this feared guy. Look, it's not 2008 anymore. And Phil Ivey had a great run of being the scariest guy. He's won all these game types. But what's the game now where people are scared Phil Ivey's there? You tell me.
I think you really have to, you kind of have to almost reach for an argument against Phil Ivey, and I think that one is by far the most credible when it comes to detracting from Phil Ivey. But to my mind, the number one thing that we're looking for when we're looking for the best player of all time is kind of a recipe of dominance and longevity of that dominance. And Ivey had that dominance across a wide variety of games for quite a large period of time. Yeah, he hasn't had the staying power in the solver era and all that, but I just don't know if it's enough to counteract just how dominant he was throughout sort of poker's golden age. And I would just have a really tough time even really hearing an argument that puts someone else above Phil Ivey.
Doug, to your point, at the World Series of Poker, this year's World Series of Poker, are you gonna cross book Ivey against a great tournament player in a large field?
Well, it's different with Phil Ivey. I would take Negreanu over Ivey,
and maybe Hellmuth.
Well, because the guys in that category, you kind of have to treat them differently because they get edge that isn't what the normal person gets because they get to be themselves. So I would take Negreanu over Ivey, and I would take Negreanu over Hellmuth. Yeah, I would take him.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is Ivey's still at the top there, right? Ivey's in the conversation. So if you want one area where today he's still at the top or one of the most profitable players, live big field tournaments, World Series of Poker is the area.
But that's very unfair because that's because of who he is. So for example, if Elon Musk played a live poker tournament, I think that he would be in a great spot.
You're going to take Musk over Ivey?
And do I now argue, well, look at how great Musk is. You have to give him credit. He'd be in a great no, because he's Elon Musk. So you can't just ignore the fact that there's marketing value or there's story value to who you are. And so that's not poker ability. That's the value of being recognized, basically. So if you're saying, well, would you crossbook Ivey versus other people? No, but it's not because I think Phil Ivey's good at poker. It's because Phil Ivey's Phil Ivey. That's not poker.
Yeah, we're just circling back to that argument. I think that's part of it. I think if Phil Ivey set up his life and his mystique in such a way that people play poorly against him, that's part of being a good poker player.
Well, let me ask you this. So if Tom Brady sits down at a poker table and people punt to Tom Brady, is that because of how he positioned himself as a poker player?
It certainly is to some
No,
extent.
no way, Kane, get out of here. No way. Are you really going to die on this hill?
Doug, I dispute the premise. I don't think that you would take Tom Brady's action over even a break-even, no-name poker professional, right? Which shows that it doesn't matter. The amount that we're talking about here that Ivey benefits from being a name doesn't matter relative to his poker abilities and his ability to read his opponents in live WSOP events.
My argument is purely that being well known when you play poker is a huge advantage.
Are you going to take Tom Brady over an average online MTTer who's not?
I think it's more so that Doug is just pointing out that someone like Tom Brady would benefit from this. He's using it as an example. He's not comparing Phil Ivey to like a player.
Let's say that Tom Brady's win rate in a game is minus 10 big blinds. And then let's just say that same player gets to play, but he's an anonymous person. I think his win rate is minus 10. I think if he sits down and he's Tom Brady, I think his win rate becomes minus 3. And I think that there's an effect for all these guys we're talking about when you talk about Ivey versus Hellmuth versus Negreanu, where they all get some plus number next to their name because of their name. That isn't their ability.
I think that makes them a great player. If they're able to position themselves such that their opponents do bad things against them, that makes them a great player.
All right, let's add Elon Musk to the list. Mike, can you still get Elon in here?
The same way that Victor Blom made you feel a certain way when you were playing him heads up, and as a result, he was able to win a few more big blinds against you, right? You made that argument at the time. He'd make his opponents feel a certain way, feel anxious about playing him, feel like he'd put them in tough spots. Ivey
would put you in tough spots. That's different.
Well, Ivey makes amateurs who he plays against feel a certain way, right?
Do you not recognize that famous people have an advantage playing poker, Kane? Just regardless of how the fame got, there's an edge to being famous.
I agree.
Okay.
And to the extent that it gives you an edge, it makes you a better poker player. Anything that gives you an edge.
We're going in circles here,
no,
lads.
that doesn't make sense.
Doug, anything that gives you an edge at the table makes you a better poker player. By definition, you are winning more playing poker.
I don't agree. I don't agree with that. I don't think that. You think that if someone so you think that just people that are famous, that fame makes them a better poker, so they are a better poker player because
I disagree with the premise, right? But assuming your premise is true, that yes, and I think there's a reason why we're not seeing Matt Damon or Ray Romano win the main event or even go deep in the main event. It's because that's a very minor factor compared to somebody's actual poker abilities.
Yeah,
right.
For sure.
Which Ivey has. So for you to say, well, Ivey's has this unfair advantage, right? Even if I grant you that argument, I think it's only true to a very minor degree. I think what matters much more is how Ivey plays against his opponents, right? And I think in the WSOP, in the large WSOP fields, Ivey is going to be one of the top 10 or 15 people I would take in those fields today.
Well, we're not going to know Kane, I think, because he's stopped playing the WSP almost every year. And regardless, going back to the point I was trying to make before, it's just that I do feel like Phil Ivey's game today is not that sharp and is not modern. And the era of Phil Ivey being a scary person at the player is gone. A person at the table is gone. And we're going to continue to see his results dwindle as he is a weaker player than the fields.
We shall see. All right, well, on that note, let's move away from Phil Ivey. Got a lot of time.
Neither one of you guys was given the case against. Someone had to step in and save this ship.
Yeah, he needs a con. I mean, how else are we supposed to have a discussion? Moving on to LLinusLLove, a.k.a. LLinusLLove, considered by many to be the current, or at least recently was, the top no-limit hold'em player. He's also had some reasonably solid success in tournaments, though that's definitely more of a side hustle for him compared to cash games. Doug, thoughts on LLinusLLove making this list and his chances of hitting that top 5?
Yeah, it's a tough one. For starters, one of the best online 6-backs cash game players ever. Also one of the best heads up no limit cash game players ever. Also some dabbling into some of the other games like PLO and whatnot. So he's been a online top dog for years now. The question really kind of boils down to, is that enough to get you into the top 5 or 10 or anything past sort of just entering the top 20? If this was on raw ability, if I had to shake up these 20 people and put them into 3 different tables and asked me, if you play the most popular game, No Limit Hold'em, just play No Limit Hold'em cash game, who is the best player? Today, it's going to obviously be Linus. Let me look at this list. Yeah, I don't think anyone would beat him. So if we're just playing the most popular game and we're playing it with all of these top people, he's the best player. How much is that worth? Because he doesn't have a live tournament resume, really. 1.8 million in earnings. Cool. Doesn't have, as my understanding, a long history of success playing in like bigger private games or anything like that. Doesn't play a lot of mixed games. I think he plays maybe a little bit of PLO. Maybe he doesn't actually play some. I'm not sure. I know he played a little bit of Raspberry Sweets. So how much do we actually, it's funny, Mike, if you ask me who's the best poker player, and I said, well, here's the guy, he is the best poker player right now. And I'm like, well, he probably shouldn't be on the list because he doesn't have enough other stuff or things that he's done or whatever. But what's the point of the list? Is the best poker player the person that is currently the best at poker? If that's what the list is, then this guy's number 1.
Well, if you're defining poker specifically as No Limit Hold'em, and I believe
most popular.
And for what it's worth, I do believe Linus started dabbling in PLO like, chat might correct me a little bit, but like maybe 2 years ago, and he hopped in and was winning quite handily against very good players like right away, mostly heads up, I think. So he did display some ability to pick up a new game type and get really good at it. Then again, the transition from No Limit to PLO certainly a lot different than moving to like something like Raz or whatever. But yeah, Linus he definitely satisfies the dominant criteria for me. Like he's been one of the most dominant players in the last, I would say. I mean, this quote we have from Andres Artanano, aka Educa Poker. That quote was from, I think, 2017, 2018. Andres was on your podcast, and you guys were talking about who the best No Limit Hold'em players were, and Andres had Linus at either number 1 or number 2. And the way you guys were talking about it then was like, well, everyone else on this list is kind of an established player. Linus is this new kid on the block, like still needs to make his money, essentially, is still super, super hungry, still has a lot to prove. That was only 4 years ago or so. So while he's had that staying power for 4 years and his star has continued to kind of be on the rise, it's still only 4 years, right? Like we're going to know a lot more about how much Linus deserves to be in this conversation in like 3 to 5 years. We'll see if he's able to be the top dog or near the top dog in the toughest games for like a decade. Maybe he dabbles into other games too. He certainly there is a path for him over the next handful of years, 10 years maybe, to be considered the greatest of all time. Right now, I just think it's a little early. Kane, what do you think about Linus here?
I think right now I would consider Linus one of the best No Limit Hold'em players of all time. One of the best. I do think, listen, having a 22.2% ROI today in 400 average buy-in tournaments online is extremely impressive. So he's doing it online in both cash games and tournaments. He's doing it live in tournaments to some degree, right? 1.8 in live tournament earnings is nothing to sneeze at. I don't know if he plays any live cash, but his No Limit Hold'em results are phenomenal. He's considered the best, if not one of the best in the world today. And he has been doing it now for a couple years, right? To be the best online at No Limit Hold'em, people don't stay there for that long, right? So the amount of time where he has stayed there, in my opinion, is already enough for him to be considered one of the best No Limit Hold'em players of all time. When we're talking about one of the best poker players of all time, I don't think so, right? It's pretty much limited to No Limit Hold'em.
I do have to bring this up because I think it is slightly relevant and it should work into our calculus to some extent, that There are people that question the legitimacy of his online play. There have been some examples of hands that went down where he picked out just incredibly accurate combos in situations that solvers very much approve of those specific combos at play. I know there have been accusations levied at him online. I'm not saying that the guy cheats. I think it's likely he does not cheat, but one of the problems with online poker, and this might be one of the reasons people weigh it less as well less valuable, is if you go play on high stakes poker, you're not cheating. You know, if you go play in the World Series of Poker, whatever, unless you're that guy that was marking cards in the heads up event, you're not cheating. Whereas when you play online, there is this bit of you don't exactly know what's going on behind the curtain. However, I think it's pretty safe to say that in No Limit Hold'em, this is the best player on our list. So how much do we weight the best No Limit Hold'em player in the world right now, or at least the best No Limit Hold'em player in our top 20? How do you weight that? Maybe you don't think that's very valuable. Maybe you think that's the most important thing, is who is the best player today. And I would actually take a step further. Linus has played No Limit Hold'em at a level none of these people ever have. How much is that worth?
Yeah, I would think a decent amount, but again, just there's literally nothing to speak of in the mixed game realm, in very little in the live tournaments. It's just, it's, you know, if like what Kane was talking about earlier, if we're making specialized list, best overall strategy in No Limit Hold'em, this guy would probably be number one, right?
I'm talking myself into some Linus, guys. I'm talking myself into it. I came in thinking I'd have him lower, and I'm talking myself into this.
When you say he's played No Limit Hold'em at a level nobody else on this list has, you mean between tournaments, cash games, sit and goes, live and online? You mean with a variety of things, or do you mean in any specific form of poker? Because you're on the list and you were the undisputed heads-up champion for heads-up No Limit Hold'em, right? You played at the highest possible level, right? The same could be said for Jungleman, right?
But Linus is much more versatile in forms of No Limit Hold'em. He's played ring, he's played heads up, he's played some live, and not very much. But I just meant overall No Limit Hold'em game. If I had to take who is the best No Limit Hold'em player on this list, I would pick Linus. And I would ask myself, other than maybe Bonomo in tournaments, or maybe I just think maybe Jungleman heads up. I mean, I'm struggling to find people in formats that I think would be better than him in No Limit Hold'em. So, yeah. I think
I would take Bonomo over Linus today in MTTs.
I would take in a live tournament, I would take Bonomo, but in their level of No Limit Hold'em play overall, I would take Linus.
Sure, he is the best No Limit Hold'em player today, and he's been the best No Limit Hold'em player for how long? 2 or 3 years?
Several years, yeah.
Yeah, 3 to 4.
It all comes down to how much you value No Limit Hold'em. I know, Doug, you gave a rough answer of it's like 80% of the list for you. So I think that for Doug's list, Doug, you should have Linus in your top 10, maybe even top 5. Right. For me, No Limit Hold'em accounts for maybe 40 or 50% of how much I judge how good somebody is of all time. And so for me, Linus is a strong candidate, you know, maybe top 50 or something, but he's not going to break my top 10.
You know, this is sort of like I drove by a car dealership that I wasn't planning on going into, and I was like, maybe I'll just see what they got. And I get in there, and then I look, and I didn't realize they had this one model, but it's sleek. And then I realized the top retracts actually convertible. And then the salesman's telling me all these awesome facts about the car, and I'm like, wow, this. And then I'm thinking about this. Should I? And you know, an hour ago, I didn't even know this dealership was here. And then here I am. I'm about to leave the parking lot in a brand new Mercedes. You know, that's basically what's happening here with Linus.
All right, guys, I have a bit of a problem. There's insanely loud construction happening outside my house. I'm gonna be on mute for most of this going forward. But let's go ahead and move on to our next person, Phil Galfond.
It's only been happening to you for months. Okay, our next guy on the list, Phil Galfond. Of course, Phil, one of the most legendary Pot Limit Omaha players of all time. He also has won several World Series of Poker bracelets and has, over the last few years, issued the Galfond Challenge, played a variety of heads-up of opponents in heads-up PLO, and he's won all of them. Every person that has challenged him has lost and or not finished the challenge where Phil is winning. Phil has been a mainstay of the online poker era for basically the entirety of it. Also had success in live poker. A little bit less live tournaments, a little bit less no limit hold'em, but more of a high stakes PLO and bit of high stakes live poker as well. Kane, what are your thoughts on Phil?
I got to disagree with you on the no limit hold'em. Back in the day when I was playing online, OMG Clay Aiken was at the very top of the no limit hold'em, to the point where when Tom Dwan posted the Dur challenge, he was the one player who was excluded from that challenge. He was a fantastic, that was for both games, Pot Limit Omaha and no limit hold'em. He sat the highest stakes no limit hold'em heads up. I don't think he'd give everybody action, right? But he was certainly one of the best heads up no limit hold'em players. He also played 6 max no limit hold'em. So I think if we're talking about big bet poker, if we're talking about no limit hold'em and Pot Limit Omaha, Phil Galfond is an absolute legend, and he has been for very many years. Regarding his current challenge, do you know if that's open to, like, who that's not open to, the Phil Galfond challenge?
I'm pretty sure anyone can play it other than people named Ben, if I'm remembering that correctly, or I don't know if that's...
Can Barry Sweet play the Phil Galfond challenge?
To my understanding, yes.
I mean, that's incredible. I mean, this is a guy who was at the very top when you and I were playing online, right? We're talking about now 14 years ago, 13 years ago, right? He was at the very top, and he's still at the very tip top of Pot Limit Omaha today. Coming into this, I thought that Phil Galfond would be on my short list for #1 in this thing. As I'm talking, I'm inching him closer and closer to literally #1.
You're about to get yourself a new Audi. So for me with Phil Galfond, I do think that my view has been skewed coming up, because by the time I was playing in the higher stakes games, Phil was no longer one of the top no limit players. He's more of a PLO guy. And realistically, I think a lot of people viewed Phil as a bit of a spot in a lot of the ring games, and certainly in no limit. But I think Phil had a little bit of a renaissance in the last 6-7 years, where he emerged as basically the ultimate end boss PLO player, where he beats everyone in heads up PLO. Obviously, he has had a lot of success in ring PLO over the past number of years as well. I didn't really follow the high stakes scene, I think, in the era where he was one of the top no limit players, although I do know that he did play in those times and was one of the best no limit players. So good online resume. You know, what's his live resume like here though, Kane? Because this starts to look, when I look at it, it's a bit good in online cash, for certainly good there, but what about in live tournaments? He's got 3 bracelets, but only a few million in live tournament earnings, kind of low for that in that regard. And how many different games was Phil Galfond playing? Has he been playing in the high stakes games, in mixed games and in no limit, or is it just mainly been PLO?
So one of his bracelets is in single draw, deuce to 7 single draw. And it looks like he's cashed in a number of stud games. You know, I don't think he's certainly, here's Pot Limit Omaha. Another one of his bracelets was in actually PLO high-low. So he's certainly not a one-trick pony. I don't think he's considered, you know, certainly one of the best at the in the world at the mixed games, but just the fact he's had that amount of success. 3 WSOP bracelets is nothing to sneeze at. I know you know that yourself, Doug. So, you know, that is a decent amount of success. I mean, the cool thing about the newer guys, right? And I'll include Galfond as one of the newer guys, right? The Galfonds and the LLinusLLoves and everything like that, is you don't need to go as much based on tournament results in determining who's the best as you do with guys like Doyle or Hellmuth or guys from back in the day, because we actually have, you know, statistics of their online winnings. And getting into that, we talked earlier about how Tom Dwan was maybe a 2 or 2.5 big blind winner in his entire online career, which isn't super impressive back when the games were that soft. Galfond, by contrast, was like a 6 big blind winner, right? Galfond was just consistently crushing high stakes, PLO, and no limit hold'em, 6 max, 9-handed, and heads up. He's if not the GOAT, one of the GOATs, in my opinion.
I feel like there were people that are pretty clearly superior to Phil Galfond in the areas he plays that did not make the top 20, and so it makes it a little bit weird to me. Like, for example, not my favorite person, but Ben Tollerine. Ben Tollerine has, over the length of his career, was a substantially better player than Phil Galfond in at least PLO, but probably in no limit as well. And then Ben Solsky, who also didn't make the top 20, he's also clearly, both Bens are in my mind better PLO players, and then also better no limit hold'em players, and they didn't even make the top 20. So it's hard.
Why aren't they challenge? Why aren't they doing the Galfond challenge?
Because it's not open to people named Ben.
Is it actually not?
I think it's not. I think it's not open to people.
I thought I'd ask you that if anybody was banned from the challenge.
I also think that those guys are all friends, so it's a little bit weird. Like, Kane, if you did a heads up challenge, I would play you. No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding.
You're trying to drum up more action. Listen, I think that I think Sauce should be on this list, and if Sauce were on the list, he would be in my top 10 for sure.
It's just hard to sit here and argue for Phil over people that played the games he plays and are, in my opinion, better than him, and they're not. It's a difficult task. I just don't agree with that. Those guys don't have the 3 WSOP bracelets, which matters, right? How much does that really, dude? Bracelets are just shams, man. Tournament, you win.
We were talking about how Hellmuth deserves to be on this list.
Because there's 16 of them. You win 3 bracelets. What does that really? Look, it just takes one good run of WSOP tournaments to win a few bracelets.
OMG Clay Aiken has won 3 WSOP bracelets in 3 different events.
I could say Tollerine has 9-10 million in live tournament earnings and has played way tougher stuff than Phil has to get it.
Look, Ben Tollerine is a good player. You must have played the high stakes a few years after me, because back when I was playing, Ben Tollerine was a high stakes bum hunter. Right, he was not battling people like Phil Galfond was. He would not have played Galfond in any form of poker. I'm talking 2008, 2009. Right, it wasn't until after that Tollerine became really, really good at PLO. I don't think he ever got to the point of being one of the top no limit hold'em players. Right, Sauce is different. Sauce was sitting heads up PLO and no limit hold'em at the highest stakes and basically willing to play anybody. But did Sauce ever play as much 6-handed? I know he was good at 6-handed.
Yeah, he played a bunch of 6-handed as well.
Yeah. So Sauce, I think you have a really strong argument there. Tollerine,
I guess I also feel like when I was talking with Tollerine back in the day for that brief few weeks before he scammed me, he was just saying a lot of negative things about Phil Galfond's PLO game. And he wanted to cut off his action, but he didn't want to insult Phil. But like, people knew that he was a spot, and so that's also influencing the way that I view this situation.
Go look at the poker table. I wish we still had poker table ratings, because Galfond was he won 5 BBs per 100 playing nosebleed stakes against many regs. Right. If you want to talk about somebody, earlier you brought up stuff shady about Bonomo. If you want to talk about somebody who there hasn't been one shady thing ever said about this guy, if you want to talk about somebody who's one of the most ethical guys in poker, right? This guy basically won Gassett's entire role heads up back in the day, and then basically gave him life coaching about how not to make that happen again, right? Of course, that's not what this list is about, but just adding some color here for Galfond. And if he's the best in 2022 to be the best heads up PLO player in the world is a pretty big accomplishment.
If this was a nice guy list, Phil Galfond would be somewhere between number 1 and 3 on here. So absolutely all-time great guy in poker, trustworthy, even though he really should have told Negreanu to hurry up on those buttons. That was ridiculous, that ruling. If this was a nice guy list, I would absolutely have Phil up there. But this is a poker list about who's the best poker player. And I think one of the interesting things here for people that they might not get access to normally is that because I was in the high stakes scene for so many years, I got to hear what actual high stakes regs said about each other and thought over those years. And I can just tell you that a lot of people for many years about Phil Galfond viewed him as certainly one of the weaker guys at the high stakes online. Like, he was a spot in a lot of the situations. You probably wouldn't want his piece of action in places. And I do think that in the last several years, because of this challenge, it has revitalized the viewpoint of how good Phil Galfond is at poker. I'm just saying it is certainly online poker centric. And I don't think that it's been as glorious for the entirety of this online period of time, which has spanned, a decade and a half.
I disagree. Galfond's in my top 5. I think for longer than a decade, he's been at the top of multiple games. I think that puts you in the top 5. I'm not saying throughout that whole.
What are you even talking about? Top of which games?
No Limit Hold'em and Pot Limit Omaha.
How long was he? When you say top, what do you mean?
Mm-hmm. When Durr issued the Durr challenge, right? Phil Galfond was perhaps number 1 in No Limit Hold'em.
Okay, so I don't know about at that specific juncture in time when the Durr challenge was issued. What I can tell you is, no, actually, I can tell you, Jungle was number 1 at No Limit Hold'em at that point, because Jungle instantly snapped it off and waited in line to get his money from Durr. Okay, so Galfond had,
but that was heads up. That was just heads up.
Talking about heads up. We're talking about ring.
No, we're talking about everything. We're talking about who was the best No Limit Hold'em player at the time.
I don't think that. So it's a while ago now. I'd have to talk to some people from that era, but I really don't think that Galfond was viewed in the way that you're describing him. I really don't think he was.
Do you think he was considered top 10 No Limit Hold'em players at the time?
Top 10, yeah, but top?
Okay.
Or like top 2 or 3? I don't think so.
In my opinion, being top 10 in No Limit Hold'em and being top 10 in Pot Limit Omaha, on and off over the course of 14 years, qualifies you for being one of the best players of all time, if not the best player of all time. If you take the 2 most competitive forms of poker and you are consistently in the top 10, sometimes maybe you dip down to the top 30, but then come back into the top 10 over 14 years, that's a pretty damn big accomplishment.
So you're saying Ben Solsky is the definitive number 1 player, because I think Ben Solsky was better at both formats than him pretty much the entire time.
Ben Solsky would be very high for me on this list. The difference between Phil Galfond and Ben Solsky is that Phil Galfond does have live results. He does have 3 WSOP bracelets, and those are in 3 different events.
Dude, it's just 3 random tournaments. Who cares?
Phil Galfond knows how to play mixed poker. Maybe he's not one of the best in the world at it, but he knows better than Ben Solsky.
You know that Sauce is extremely good at mixed poker, right?
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's like ridiculously good. He started playing a bunch of those games, played J Llama. Sauce is better than Galfond in every way other than these 3 tournament bracelets that you're putting a bunch of weight on. All right.
Except he won't play him heads up PLO. He won't play him heads up PLO right now.
He's not allowed to play him heads up PLO, Kane. How many times do I have to tell you this over and over again?
Apparently 3. Apparently 3.
Jesus
All
Christ.
Right, moving on. That was a spirited discussion, wasn't it? All right, moving on to Jason Koon, Koon 1985. Another one of those super high rollers who has a lot of cashes in those high stakes tournaments, but he definitely gets in the mix in the high stakes cash games as well, particularly the live ones. I'm not super familiar with his online cash game experience. He does have some great results in online tournaments. A lot of his stuff is it's either opted out or removed, so you can't see a lot of his results on places like Sharkscope, but on one of the places you can, which is GG. He's got 680K profit with a 19% ROI, 9.2K average buy-in. That's a relatively small sample, but still very impressive versus some of the best players in the world at very high stakes average buy-in. All right, Kane, what do you think about Jason Koon making this top 20?
I think again, if we've gotten into the nicest guys in poker list here, Jason Koon should be at the top of that list as well. Jason Koon doesn't have the versatility for me. He's a fantastic No Limit Hold'em tournament player, also a fantastic No Limit Hold'em cash player. He has dabbled a little bit into short deck, and he's a good short deck player, although I don't think he was ever considered one of the best short deck players. So he was always relatively better at No Limit Hold'em than short deck, but he hasn't gotten into the other forms of poker. I don't think he really battles heads up. I think, Doug, you'd be able to speak to that more than I can. So even though Jason Koon is currently and has been now for a couple of years one of the top No Limit Hold'em players, I just don't see the versatility, and I don't know how much success he's really had online. Doug, do you?
I don't think that he's had a lot of success in at least cash games online historically. I don't know what the case might be over the last 2 or 3 years, so maybe that's changed dramatically. What strikes me about Jason Koon is that I don't think that he is much of a natural talent. I think if I looked at this list, I would put him around last for naturally good at poker. But what I will say about Jason Koon is I think that he might be the hardest worker of this entire list. The guy just shows up every day. He's constantly trying to improve. He really cares. He's always working on his game. And he's fought tooth and nail for many years to put himself in the position that he is today, to be a really good high stakes player that people know is sharp and balanced and is up to date on both cash games and tournaments for No Limit Hold'em. So yeah, I think a player like that doesn't really end up playing a lot of mixed games. If Jason does, then I apologize for saying he doesn't. But my understanding is he doesn't play PLO, he doesn't play mixed games, doesn't play all these different formats. He really specializes in high stakes tournaments and cash games, and he's really good at them. And he has a good win rate in those games and is very, very sharp. So if you're looking for someone that battles at all kinds of different formats and heads up and this and that, then yeah, not going to be your guy, but still an absolute beast when it comes to No Limit Hold'em.
One final point against Koon. I think if you want to talk about who's the best poker player of all time, this needs to be somebody who is able to adjust to the games he's playing, and that when he's playing against the high roller fields and some of the toughest players in the world, they take a more balanced GTO approach. And when they get into live, larger field MTTs, they're able to really exploit their opponents. And Jason Koon doesn't strike me as that type of guy. He strikes me as a guy who's always playing the right ranges, who's always kind of on the top of his game, playing a GTO balanced approach. And he's going to be highly competitive in those highly competitive fields. Right, but all of a sudden, when you put him in a large field tournament, Jason Koon wouldn't be one of the first guys that I'm taking. And all of a sudden, when you put somebody at the table who's just dumping money, right, I don't think that Jason Koon's one of the guys I would pick to be able to exploit that and adapt to it.
I could see that's a fair critique. Oh, one more thing about Jason Koon. I think that one of the reasons why I've also viewed his game as sort of like the opposite of some of the other players that I feel like have kind of faded out of the spotlight because of their inability to adjust to a modern game. Jason Koon's done the opposite. Koon was kind of known as a nit for many years. He was known as someone that didn't really put you in spots, wouldn't really bluff enough. And he has changed that by learning the correct way and is now very capable of bluffing the correct amount and does bluff the correct amount in a lot of situations where before he was viewed as kind of a nit. And when I see someone step outside of what are their constraints and their view of how the game should be played and into what's correct in a balanced way, I think that progression should have a lot of value. And being able to analyze your own game and realize that you have those shortcomings and improve on them. I don't know if Jason would say he was a nit back in the day or not, but at least the way that he plays, there's something to be said on being able to change your game to be more correct from the problems that you had in the past.
All right, on that note, we got 2 players left, and it's time for Stu Ungar, legend of the game with 3 main event victories. Now, I would have made a joke that that's going to be really important to Kane, but Kane, you had actually said in our chat before this, you had talked to a poker historian. I don't remember the guy's name if you want to give him a shout out, but you had said you were actually gonna come in with some hot takes on Stu Ungar after your discussion with that guy. So you want to kick this off here?
Yeah, I don't think that Stu Ungar should be on this list. He was very successful in the live tournament scene, but he was always considered kind of a spot in live cash games. When he was on his A game, right, he could be a winner in those cash games. But then if you got him not on his A game, which happened quite frequently, right, he was just a dumper. And so as a result, live cash games would be formed around Stu. And I think that is a disqualification for being on any list of best poker player of all time. I think if there are people who are trying their hardest to get you in games to play against you, then you're automatically disqualified from being considered even one of the best players of all time. I don't think that Stu belongs on this list. I don't think that Stu belongs on a top 100 list of best poker players of all time. If we're talking about best gin rummy players of all time, Stu's number one, probably. If we're talking about who has one of the best memories of all time, you know, Stu is certainly on the top of that list as well, right? There are a lot of amazing things about Stu Ungar. And even if we're talking about, you know, tournament results at the World Series of Poker, now we can talk about Stu being on that list. But if we're talking about the best poker player of all time, it needs to be somebody who is able to play well at least a 95+% of the time that they're playing poker. And anybody who is so easily put on tilt or so easily chasing losses that they become a spot a majority of the time that they play cash games, that person shouldn't be in the conversation.
Doug, do you want to make any points? Yeah, go ahead.
I want to add another note here that this is a bit off topic, but his 1997 main event championship has to be one of the all-time great your back's up against the wall championships. My understanding was the guy was completely broke. I think someone put him into that event. He had nothing. Obviously, there was a lot of drug usage in Ungar's history. And he comes into the main event and just ships it for, what was it, $1 million up top? That's got to be an all-time great you're back up against the wall tournament story. The other ones that kind of spring to mind are the Mizrachi year, the year that he didn't realize he had to pay taxes and he owed the IRS some ungodly number, and then he won the 50K Players Championship. That's up there too, back against the wall. Kane, what would be your all-time back against the wall poker victory?
Oh, this one's super easy. If you remember Seth from back in the day, he had a big picture of a stake online. He was like a 9-handed ring player who won at half a big blind per 100 in scout games. He was never very, very good. He was living with Go Muck Yourself, Fantastic Cow, and a couple others in LA, and this like baller place, and it came time to pay rent. And Seth, in Seth fashion, said, "Oh man, rent's due? Man, I guess I better play some poker." He just hadn't been playing. He gets online. He listens to some like self-help book on motivation. Right, that day he enters this like stars special like W Coop $315, wins it for 600,000, whatever, pays his rent, puts the rest in Bitcoin, or about a third of the rest in Bitcoin when Bitcoin was about 50 cents a coin, and today he is the wealthiest person I know.
Wow.
That is incredible. Yeah, that's not just back against the wall. That's like going forward as well, you know? Like, that's unreal. Like, it's hard to, even like his EV, how much it goes down if he just like got third in that tournament, you know? It's crazy. Like,
he bought a couple of Bitcoin miners, started buying and mining Bitcoin when it was sub $1, and so that's probably the most amazing story. Didn't work out quite that way for Stu. He was always in the money and out the money. Actually, my favorite, since Stu's the one we're talking about, my favorite Stu story is kind of a couple years, I think, before that 97 main event. He was broke, and they were talking, you know, he was talking with a group of people just about how amazing Stu's memory was, and one of the casino owners just didn't really believe the lore of how good Stu's thing is. And he said, "I'll tell you what, we'll set up a 6-deck shoe, and I'll deal out half the cards of the 6-deck shoe, and you need to name the remaining 156 cards that are there." And Stu basically looked at him like, "Is this guy crazy? That's no problem." And Stu found somebody else to put up the money. It was a $100,000 bet, and Stu just did it in like, 5 minutes. It was like tying his shoe to Stu Ungar to just list off the remaining 3 decks of a 6-deck shoe. So this guy's memory was just unbelievable, but he played way too loose in cash games. He played way too many hands. He played way too spewy. If we want to talk about an Isildur of his time, Stu might be a good example of that. I think that's maybe a fair comparison.
That ability had to cross over really well to some of the cash games at the time, I would imagine, because Stud was big, and in Stud, knowing what cards are dead is a huge part of the game.
Yeah, it definitely helped that Stud was Stu's best form of poker, but Stu's problem is he wanted to play everything, and he wanted to play the highest stakes game, and he wanted the highest action that he could ever have. and specifically in the big bet game, specifically in No Limit Hold'em, right? He was a spot. He was playing 50% plus of hands in No Limit Hold'em in an era where his opponents were just showing him kings and aces by the river.
Makes sense why he was better in tournaments too, because he had the ante, and then
yep,
it's a lot looser. All right, let's. This brings us to our final person on the list today, guys.
Chidwick.
I know Kane's gonna love this one. Steven Chidwick. Kane, how about you kick us off here?
Well, you know what's interesting about Steven Chidwick, and I'm glad we're doing it kind of close to Jason Koon to compare those two, because both are at the top of elite No Limit Hold'em tournament players, right? But I think what separates Stevie and why I would put him a step above Koon here is because, unlike Koon, I do think that Stevie is better able to switch gears against playing the best in the world versus playing against people in a soft field. I'm not sure if you guys got a chance to tune into any of the main event last year where Steve Chidwick made a little bit of a deep run. Just seeing some of the things he did, like solvers are not doing those things. Those are not GTO things. Like, he was going really out of the box to win some chips, and it was working out for him. In addition to that, Chidwick's somebody who had success before he even got into tournaments at online cash games. I was playing against Stevie in 6-handed and 9-handed No Limit Hold'em games back in the day. He wasn't one of the strongest players at the table, right? But he was winning 3-4 big blinds per 100 in those games back then.
And if you were in them, they were definitely good. Steven, I met him for the first time, I want to say about a decade ago. There was a Christmas dinner in Canada, and I went and he was there, and we did some flips. And my understanding at that point was he was mainly playing smaller stakes stuff online. He wasn't really much of a high stakes dude. And then it seemed like 5 years later, he was just one of the absolute top crushing tournament players. So he certainly had a transformation, a little bit similar to I think Jason Koon, where he went from playing in a lot more reasonable stake games to just being an absolute top-notch crusher. But the drawback to Stevie is going to be very similar to some of these other players in this list, where he really just plays tournaments, is my understanding. And so despite being one of the best, very accomplished, talented tournament player, he still is a tournament player, and that's gonna knock you on this list.
Yeah. I personally would put him ahead of the other tournament players on this list, I think, with the exception of maybe Z Justin, because I think Z Justin did compete at a higher level against tougher opponents online back in the day. And also, I think Z Justin has had better live tournament results.
So you'd put him over a Hellmuth?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. No. I'm talking specifically. I was thinking specifically about Fader, Z Justin, Koon.
Some more of the new school tournament guys.
Yeah, but Jakoon's not just a tournament guy in that way, I don't think. Jakoon's also a cash game guy. It's not. I wouldn't pigeonhole Koon as much in that way. So who other than Fedor that plays tournaments are we putting him over?
I would say Koon. I would say the other people I put in that category were Koon and Bonomo. Okay. I mean, yeah.
So the fact that Koon plays cash, you don't value that? Because
no, I do value that, but from my experience,
I don't want to phrase that badly. You're saying that it's not as valuable as how much better Steven Chidwick is at tournaments, basically.
No, what I'm saying is that I don't know enough about Koon's cash game prowess compared to what I know about Stevie's cash game prowess online. And I know that back in the day when I was playing against Stevie, he was considered like a decent reg in cash games. I don't know how good Koon currently is at cash games or has ever been at cash games. So I was actually working with the opposite assumption that Steven Chidwick is more accomplished in cash games than his Koon.
That might be, that might be the case. I guess I hadn't heard of him playing much cash, but it's totally possible. The last few years I haven't been the most plugged in on who's playing what. So it's certainly possible that he is like a Koon and that they both play those games. That wasn't my understanding.
Do you remember when you played online ever playing against Stevie?
No, never played Stevie. It was never in one of my games.
Yeah. So I played with him back then. So I think just having that, I don't know if Jason Koon plays online cash these days. And I don't know if Steven ever plays online.
I think Jason Koon plays on the GG or the coin poker stuff. I imagine he's in at least one of those two streets. I don't have as much to add for Chidwick.
He's one of those guys who you just really feel his presence at the poker table, right? If you want to talk about like Phil Ivey or Phil Hellmuth getting an edge because of their their reputation preceding them, Stephen Chidwick is able to get that edge without needing the reputation, right? He just makes amateurs feel very, very uncomfortable at the table, not in a bad way, but instead in a way where like they just don't want to get in a pot against him because he's constantly glaring at them and staring them down, and he just has this presence of like somebody you don't want to enter pots against.
It reminds me of that one meme, the choose your fighter meme, that someone posted of him and let me show you this. Am I able to show this for the? Oh yeah, this is great. For everyone that has video, I'm gonna share my screen really quick. We're done with the slideshow, right, Brady? We can close that out.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So this is a meme I saw on Twitter from Darren Elias a couple years ago now. Choose your fighter, no blinking. And this is what you mean. Fun for good makes Rex feel bad, but not in a bad way, or this seems maybe in a bad way.
Well, what I think is it gives him an advantage, right? It makes recreationals scared to enter a pot against him. Also, I think it makes people less likely to want to bluff him in general. For whatever reason, people think that if somebody's staring at you, maybe I shouldn't bluff because maybe they'll pick up on something.
I think that it's stupid and bad for poker. And I think that the unnecessary stare downs are one of the things that's wrong with the game today and are unbearable. I'll tell you what, you're right. It works on me. I don't want to be around it. It's super annoying to deal with. The tanking, the staring.
Well, what if it doesn't?
What
if it doesn't result in tanking? What if he's just literally staring at you and acting just as fast as you or I do, but he's staring at everybody as they act?
You know, Kane, people have to want to play. And if you're staring everyone down all the time, they don't want to be around that. I think it's kind of clear cut. You're just saying, okay, my EV goes up. I'm going to make this shittier for you. This is what I'm doing. And I mean, whatever. If it's important to increase your EV, then go for it. But I do think it is shitty to play poker and have to deal with that all the time. Every time you do stuff, it's shitty.
Are you're one of the people who doesn't want to play against a player like that? You think that's true of amateurs?
I'm telling you right now, if you ask recreational players, if you ask them, every time that it gets to you, a pro aggressively stares you down. Do you not care, or do you not like that? I'm going to tell you that they're going to say that they don't like that because it's annoying and it's sort of almost disrespectful, and you don't want to have to deal with that shit. I'm telling you right now, if we poll people don't like it.
Right.
And so you're just basically saying, I'm going to get more money here, so I'm going to do this. But instead, you're hurting the other person's enjoyment for poker. I don't know. We're getting pretty off topic here. But
Does that
I guarantee you.
Getting back onto topic, does that knock Stevie at all on your list?
Not as a poker as a poker player, it is a slight edge, I guess, in terms of your EV immediately. I wouldn't factor it in. This is more of just a tangential things that make poker worse. It's things like that.
Fair.
All right, guys, that's our list. I hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't, tough shit, because you guys voted it. So really, it's your own fault. We are about to go live with the next round of voting. The way that it's going to work is you have 20 people to choose from. You get to pick ranking your own 1 to 20. Obviously, this podcast reflected our opinions, and it took 3.5 hours. So it was a lot of opinions. Your opinions are what count. So head on over to upsyncpoker.com/vote. I think we should be live right now. You can also see the results.
No, that's just for 21 plus, because people were very curious about that.
Yeah, I was going to say that. You can also see the results of the 21 place and further what all the rankings were for each player, so you can see what people were ranked at. And guys, look, I know that it is obviously a bit of a popularity contest, but please try to vote for what you feel, for who you feel deserves to be ranked higher in terms of who is the better poker player, and not just who do I like and who do I not like. And yeah, it was very unfair the way they treated Bulzari and Kane. Lord knows what they would have done if Craig Wright was on this list.
Oh yeah.
Craig, Kane, I gotta say, I actually had to give, before we go today, I have to give you some credit where credit is due. I think your Craig Wright Satoshi take is one of the all-time worst takes on my podcast. But the fact you were willing to have that take in the face of adversity, I got to give props for the balls it takes to be able to come on here and say that. So I thank you for that take, because it's definitely people are still chattering about that one to this day.
I thought you were going to concede that after the recent court case that the probability of him being Satoshi is going up, but
No, I wasn't going to say that. That would be incorrect. But again, have to respect the confidence to get out there and be willing to have that take. Definitely, always love having you on the pod.
Appreciate that, Doug.
Okay, and then Brady, you have construction going on in the background, so we're not going to hear from you again. And for you at home, we're going to finalize this podcast or finalize this list by, I think, Monday. Voting cuts off, so get in there fast and vote. Rank your players, and then we're going to be back next week with the exciting conclusion of who is the best poker player of all time. We'll see you then. Thank you for tuning in.